It was early morning, somewhere between 5:30 and 6 a.m. I awoke to a bright, sunny end-of-July day. Sunlight streamed through the open curtains, filling the room with golden light. I had been in a deep sleep, having only gone to bed a couple of hours earlier. As I opened my eyes, I was still disoriented, taking a moment to catch my bearings. I was lying on my back, my right arm stretched out and hanging off the side of the bed. My boyfriend was sound asleep beside me. I hadn't even had time to move when it happened. In that split second, every hair on my body stood on end. My entire body stiffened as an overwhelming sensation swept over me. The only thing I could move were my eyes, which were now wide open, scanning the room. I didn't know why I was awake, but something felt profoundly different. Then I sensed it. It flew in through the window. Although I couldn't physically see it with my eyes, its image was as clear as day in my mind's eye. This creature was unlike anything I had ever imagined. It was more gray than black, reptilian in form, with a long triangular face, black slit eyes, and a sleek, graceful body. Its two wings weren't fully extended, as if it were gliding on an unseen current of air. Its forked tail was as long as its body, trailing behind it. The room was eerily still as it passed, and I can still recall the silence of its flight. The creature flew in through the window, losing altitude as it crossed over our bed. Its long, elegant tail brushed against the very tips of my outstretched fingers before it continued its trajectory, disappearing through the wall of the open closet. It was there and gone in an instant, but its presence left an indelible mark on me. Throughout the event, the only thing I moved were my eyes, following its flight. When it vanished, I remained frozen, lying in complete shock. My mind raced to make sense of what I had just experienced. I turned my head to look at my boyfriend, who had woken up. He noticed my wide, startled eyes, drowsily smiled, and asked what was wrong. Not wanting to scare him, or have him think I was crazy, I smiled back and lied, telling him it was nothing. Even as I brushed it off, I couldn't shake the feeling of what I just witnessed. It wasn't malevolent, and I knew it wasn't interested in us. Somehow I just knew. This wasn't an evil presence. It felt ancient, powerful, and entirely detached from us, an otherworldly being that had crossed our path by chance. I was startled and amazed but not afraid. I might have written it off as a dream if my boyfriend hadn't woken up at the same time and spoken to me. I believe its energy woke him as well. We stayed in that apartment for only another month, leaving at the end of the summer. Nothing else unusual happened during our time there. I eventually confided in a friend who had grown up in the same town. She wasn't surprised. She had heard stories about strange occurrences in the area. The town is close to American Indian reservations and had been inhabited by native peoples for thousands of years before settlers arrived. She told me there was a long history of unusual sightings and phenomena there. Years later, I visited a hot springs about 10 hours away with my family. The local American Indian lore said the springs were formed by dragons' tears. Hearing that story made me think back to what I had seen that morning. It gave me chills but also a sense of validation. For the first time, I could put a name to what I'd witnessed. A dragon. What I saw was unlike any depiction of dragons I'd known growing up. People often associate such beings with demonic energy, but what I experienced was nothing like that. The energy this creature exuded was powerful, ancient, and neutral, neither good nor evil. I've since seen drawings and stories that resemble what I saw, but I still struggle to describe it perfectly. Thank you for reading. I'd love to know if anyone has heard of American Indian legends involving dragons or has experienced something similar. This happened in northwest Montana, and it's a memory that will stay with me forever. My boyfriend and I moved into a larger apartment in our building after the previous tenant, an elderly man we adored, moved out. He was a kind soul who loved sharing stories about his younger days. Unfortunately, he was diagnosed with cancer and had to leave the apartment shortly before his passing. When the opportunity to upgrade came, we jumped on it. For the first few months, things were relatively normal. We experienced small oddities, restless nights, a persistent feeling of unease, but we chalked it up to the quirks of living in an older building. Bad plumbing, creaky floors, and poor insulation seemed like logical explanations for most of it. About 2 months in, we adopted a dog. At night, he was restless and often growled at nothing. We assumed he was just adjusting to the new environment, brushing off his behavior as normal puppy antics. But then, things started to change. I began waking up in the middle of the night, gripped by an inexplicable fear. Tasks as simple as getting a glass of water became internal battles. I'd usually walk through the apartment in the dark, but now, I found myself needing every light on. Eventually, I bought sheer curtains for our 4-poster bed just so I wouldn't feel like I was being watched. When I confided in my boyfriend, I was relieved to hear he felt the same way. He admitted that sometimes it felt like unseen eyes were on him, and he would get chills so intense they made him hesitate before moving in the dark. While it was comforting to know I wasn't alone in these feelings, it also made everything seem more real and more frightening. On June 27th, we were informed that our beloved former neighbor had passed away. His death was emotional for the entire building. After attending his funeral a few days later, we came home and reminisced about his stories, laughing and crying in his memory. That night, the apartment felt different. Cold, empty, and hollow. We assumed it was grief, the heaviness of knowing he was truly gone. We went to bed, but at 2 a.m., I woke up thirsty and groggily went to the kitchen for water. As I refilled my glass, I heard low mumbling coming from the entryway. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just my sleepy mind playing tricks. As I headed back to bed, the dog leapt off the bed and ran to the entryway, growling low and steady. When the mumbling started again, he sprinted back to my side, positioning himself between me and the door. His protective behavior unnerved me, but I brushed past him, eager to return to bed. He followed closely, never letting me walk between him and the entryway. I handed my boyfriend the glass of water, jokingly telling him to use his big boy voice next time he wanted a drink. Confused, he replied that he hadn't asked for water. I froze. I told him I'd heard him mumbling, but he shook his head, saying he thought I'd been calling the dog to take him out. Everything clicked in that moment. Something had spoken, and both the dog and I had reacted to it. Terrified, we left the lights on and pulled the bed curtains tightly around us for the rest of the night. The next day, we tried to act like nothing had happened. We went about our routine, but by the time we were driving home from errands, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I started ranting about how scared I'd been, and my boyfriend admitted he'd felt the same. It was a relief to talk about it, but the unease lingered. A few days later, I was lying in bed while my boyfriend showered, deciding whether to get up or enjoy 10 more minutes under the covers. I was wide awake, lying on my stomach and staring at the headboard. At the foot of the bed, our dog was twitching in his sleep, caught in what seemed like a bad dream. As I started to lift my head, every hair on my body stood on end. My heart pounded as a paralyzing sense of dread washed over me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was behind me. The dog woke abruptly, growling deeply, a sound I'd never heard from him before. He sounded older, bigger, more threatening than a puppy should. My body froze, my hands gripping the pillows as tears stung my eyes. Then, clear as day, I heard a deep, raspy voice command, "Get out of the apartment." In an instant, I shot out of bed, yelling, "Leave us alone!" My boyfriend burst into the room seconds later to find me trembling, barely able to explain what had happened. When I told him I hadn't taken the dog outside yet, his face went pale. He told me he'd heard the front door open and close while he was in the shower. Since that morning, things have only gotten worse. The uneasy feeling hasn't gone away, and the occurrences have become more frequent. I don't know what's happening in this apartment, but whatever it is, it's not friendly, and it's not letting us live in peace. I've always been interested in ghosts, even as a kid. I loved ghost stories and hearing about other people's experiences, but it wasn't until I became a teenager that I had my own encounters. My experiences didn't start until we moved into a certain house, and to this day, I believe there was something in that house. My family still owns it, but it's being rented out now. If the renters ever move out, I'd love to go back and investigate. The house was about 20 miles outside one of Montana's major cities. I was 15 when we moved in, and this was the first time I'd ever had my own room. Until then, I'd always shared with my sister, so I was excited about the move. The house was large and had an unusual layout, which would become significant in later experiences. Here's a quick rundown of the house's setup. The basement was unfinished, cold cement walls and floors, with one finished bedroom. When you came down the stairs, there was a bedroom to the right and a furnace room to the left. Further down the hall, there was a storage room on the right, a laundry room on the left, and an open area with a fireplace at the end. The finished bedroom had wood-paneled walls, built-in closets, and drawers. While I almost wanted it for its charm, it was dark, cold, and the single window looked out under the porch. I ended up choosing an upstairs room instead, and I'm so glad I did. The main floor had 3 entrances. One led into a hot tub room, which might have been a converted garage. It had doors to both the backyard and the front yard. From there, 3 steps led up into the kitchen. The kitchen opened into a dining area with French doors to the backyard, which connected to the living room. From the living room, a short hallway led to a bathroom and 2 bedrooms. Another door in the living room led up to the second floor, where my bedroom was. My bedroom was like 2 rooms in one. After climbing the stairs, you could go right to the bathroom or left down an open hallway lined with built-in bookshelves that served as a railing. This hallway opened into a small space where I kept my dresser. From there, a door led to the main bedroom where I kept my bed and desk. We moved into the house in January, and my first strange experience happened not long after. I'd just gotten home from school and noticed my dad's truck wasn't in the driveway, so I assumed he wasn't home. I let myself in through the hot tub room and headed toward the kitchen. That's when I heard voices coming from the basement, talking and laughing, unmistakably male. I thought I heard my dad among them, but it sounded like more than 2 people. Curious, I called out, "Dad? Dad, I'm home." The voices stopped. I waited, expecting to hear a response or see my dad come up the stairs. But nothing happened. The basement lights were off, but I didn't think much of it since it was daytime. Then the voices started again. They were muffled, like they were coming from deep within the basement. My heart started pounding as I debated what to do. This was the early 90s and we didn't have cell phones. Should I grab the cordless phone and call for help? Should I go outside and wait for my dad? What if someone had broken in? I called out again, louder this time, "Dad!" Once again, the voices stopped. I stood frozen, straining to hear anything else. After a moment, the voices resumed, but now it sounded like only 2 people. I couldn't make out what they were saying, just the cadence of their conversation. My gut told me something was wrong, but I worked up the nerve to move further into the house. I figured if I stayed close to an exit, I could make a run for it if I needed to. Eventually, I calmed down enough to rationalize it. Maybe there was a radio or TV left on in the basement. But later, when I checked, there was nothing, no radios, no TVs, nothing that could explain the voices. That's when the experience really started to bother me. I felt immense relief when my dad finally pulled into the driveway. I told him, "I thought I heard you talking when I got home. It must have been the wind." He asked where I'd heard the voices, and I told him they'd come from the basement. He went down to check, probably to add wood to the stove more than anything, but found nothing. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I shrugged it off as one of those strange things you just can't explain. But after more unsettling experiences in that house, I started to wonder if those voices had been something more. This is just the beginning of what happened to me in that house. There's much more to share, especially involving the basement. I'll write more soon, but for now, I'll leave you with this. There really was something in that house. What is it about basements? They seem to carry a heavy, unsettling energy, and my parents' house was no exception. As I reflect on all the experiences I had there during my teenage years, I realize the best way to share them is to go level by level. Each floor had its own stories, its own haunting moments. My first account focused on hearing voices, my very first encounter in the house. Now, I'll recount everything I experienced in the basement. The voices weren't a one-time event. After that first day coming home from school, I heard them multiple times. It got to the point where, if I had to go down to the basement, I'd mentally prepare myself beforehand. If I was home alone, I'd turn on the light at the top of the stairs and call out loudly, "I'm coming down now." Then, as I descended, I'd sing or hum as loudly as I could, as if trying to fill the space with sound that wasn't theirs. Oddly enough, this helped. The voices didn't come as often when I did this. No one else in my family ever mentioned hearing the voices. My brother and sister were hearing impaired, so they wouldn't have noticed anyway, and my mom only went downstairs for laundry. She was a practical person who didn't believe in ghosts, at least not in our house. My dad, however, had his own strange experiences, which I'll share later. We also had a little dog, Weenie, who had been with us since she was a puppy. She was supposed to be mine, but she adored my dad and would follow him everywhere, except to the basement. Weenie hated the basement. If I started down the stairs, she'd stop at the top, tail tucked between her legs, staring down into the darkness. Her head would lower, and she'd wait anxiously for me to come back up. A few times, I carried her down with me for courage, but as soon as her paws hit the floor, she'd dart back upstairs, tail tucked, occasionally glancing back at me as if to warn me. Once she was back at the top, she'd stand there, stiff and trembling, staring into the basement. I never understood why she acted that way, but it unnerved me every time. My dad noticed her behavior too. He was home a lot due to an injury from his railroad job, and he often went downstairs to load the wood stove or do laundry. He'd call Weenie to follow him, but she never would. He mentioned how she'd shake and refuse to budge, even when he tried coaxing her. Once, while tending the stove, he said he spun around with the poker in his hand, convinced someone was standing behind him. Another time, he heard someone call his name. Thinking it was our neighbor, Lyle, he shouted back, "Yeah, Lyle, I'm down here." He quickly finished loading the stove and headed upstairs, still talking, only to find the house empty. The scariest experience I had involving the basement wasn't when I was down there, but when I was upstairs. It was nighttime and I was in the kitchen on the phone with a friend. The living room light was on, but the dining room and kitchen were dark. That's when I heard footsteps coming up the basement stairs. They reached the top, paused, then went back down. At first, I thought it was my mom doing laundry. I continued talking, but the footsteps started again. That's when I realized the basement light wasn't on. My mom wouldn't walk up and down those dark stairs. The footsteps reached the top step again, then descended. My stomach turned as it dawned on me. It couldn't be her. I leaned back to peek into the living room and saw my entire family sitting there watching TV. Whatever was in the basement wasn't one of them. I froze, heart pounding, as the footsteps hit the bottom step and started back up again. Slowly, I backed away from the kitchen, keeping my eyes on the basement door. The steps reached the top once more, then began descending again. I moved to the dining room table and sat where I could see the stairs, my body tense and trembling. Finally, the sounds stopped. I didn't see anything emerge, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. Writing about it now, it doesn't seem as terrifying as it felt at the time. But in that moment, my fear was overwhelming. Even now, I get chills thinking about it. I wish I'd had the courage to turn on the light and check, but I know I probably wouldn't have found anything. Just like with so many of the basement's strange happenings. There's more to tell about my time in that house, and the basement is just one piece of the puzzle. The stairs, the voices, and even Weena's behavior all pointed to something unseen and unexplainable. It was as if the basement held secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The main floor of my parents' house, where I grew up as a teenager, was the setting for one of my most unsettling experiences. Something that scared me at the moment it happened, unlike most other events that only frightened me after I had time to process them. When I sat down to reflect on this floor, I realized it had been a surprisingly busy level, not just for me but for others who experienced strange occurrences there. One of the oddest things involved our pets. We had a small dog named Weenie, who you may remember from my other stories about the basement, and 3 cats. However, only one of the cats, a black one, ever acted strangely. Sometimes, whether I was alone in the house or not, Weenie and the black cat would sit and stare at the wall where our piano was. They weren't looking directly at the piano but just off to the side of it. The first time I noticed this, I spoke to Weenie, but she didn't respond. She just flicked her ear slightly, as if she'd heard me but wasn't interested. Breaking their focus took more than words. I often had to touch one of them to snap them out of it, and even then they barely reacted. The creepiest moments happened when I was home alone. I remember sitting on the couch near that wall, watching them stare in unison. Occasionally, their heads would move together, following something invisible. It was deeply unsettling. I once asked my mom what she thought they were looking at. She guessed they were hearing something we couldn't, like mice in the walls. She was terrified of mice and insisted they must be the cause, though we only ever found 1 or 2 a year. Another strange occurrence happened in my sister's room, one of 2 bedrooms on the main floor. After I had my children, I stayed with my parents temporarily while waiting for military housing. My youngest daughter, then about 1.5 years old, slept in a crib in that room. The crib had a toy attached to the side, one of those with little fish, soothing music, and a soft light. It played 3 songs on a loop, but I had always disliked the second song and would skip it by pressing the button. I started noticing that the toy would skip the second song automatically, even when I wasn't near it. If I stood next to the crib, the second song would play, but as soon as I stepped away, it would skip to the third. My oldest child even asked me why it was skipping. I couldn't explain it. That same room has another layer of mystery tied to it. My dad once mentioned hearing that the house's previous owner had lost both his wife and daughter to a car accident on the nearby highway. I've never been able to confirm this rumor, but the highway had claimed many lives over the years. Adding to the strangeness, my mom and I once used an Ouija board. I was a teenager then and didn't know better. The board indicated there were 2 spirits in the house. I made sure to say goodbye and haven't touched an Ouija board since. The creepiest incident involving that room happened to my grandmother, and I heard the story directly from her before she passed. She was visiting and staying in my sister's room. One night, as she was getting ready for bed and wearing her CPAP mask, she saw a girl enter the room. From the light of the window, she assumed it was my sister. The figure was short, with long hair, and walked over to the crib by the window. My grandmother thought she was grabbing a blanket, as my mom often stored extras in the crib when the kids weren't using it. She told her friend, who was in the room with her, to turn on the light. When he did, the girl was gone. The crib was untouched, and the door had remained closed the entire time. Not all the unsettling experiences were tied to spirits. My brother, during a dark time in his life, once tried to harm himself in the kitchen. He later told us that he'd seen a demon or devil-like figure in the bathroom mirror. He was terrified and didn't understand why it was there or what it wanted. With counseling and returning to his church, those visions stopped. I'm not sure if this was related to the house or something internal to him, but it added to the overall tension the home seemed to hold. Even my youngest child had experiences tied to this house. While visiting my parents, she once came into my old room and asked to sleep on the floor because she couldn't sleep downstairs. She said, "There are too many little Jaycees running around," referring to herself. She claimed the little Jaycees were noisy, talking, and trying to play with her, even though she'd asked them to leave. It was another layer of mystery tied to that house, which seemed to affect everyone differently. But the one event that truly scared me happened one morning before school. My dad had called up to let me know he'd be leaving and wouldn't be there when I came downstairs. After showering and getting ready, I went downstairs and stood by the French doors in the dining room, looking outside. Suddenly, I felt someone flip my hair, a thing my brother used to do to annoy me. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was my dad, though it was unlike him to do something playful like that. But I knew he wasn't home. I turned to say, "Dad," but stopped mid-word when I realized no one was there. I'd felt the hand brush against my neck. My hair had moved. I looked around frantically, seeing nothing. Grabbing my backpack, I bolted out the nearest door and stood at the bus stop, staring at the house, half expecting to see something in the windows. I was 15 minutes early to the stop, far earlier than usual. That moment remains the only experience in that house that scared me as it happened, probably because it involved physical contact. When I later mentioned the house to a friend, she told me, "All those houses in that area are haunted." She didn't seem surprised at all. The house still holds many stories, but the main floor had its share of strange and unforgettable moments. I've had a hard time writing about my experiences in the upstairs of my childhood home. Part of it is because one of my stories was stolen and posted elsewhere without my permission, but I've decided not to let that stop me. These stories are mine and I want to share them. As a teenager, having the entire upstairs to myself was a dream come true. After sharing a room with my sister for as long as I could remember, having my own space was a luxury. If you've read my previous stories, you might recall the layout. At the top of the stairs, there was a bathroom on the right, built from what was once a large storage area. To the left, a sharp turn led to a hallway overlooking the main floor, separated by built-in bookshelves to prevent anyone from falling. There were 2 connected rooms upstairs. The first was too small for a bed, so I used it for my antique dresser and bookshelves. The second, larger room was my main bedroom, where I kept my bed, desk, stereo, and clothes. The upstairs always felt different. It wasn't as overtly unsettling as the basement, but it had its own quirks. None of the animals liked being up there, which hurt me a little because I loved our pets. Weenie, our small dog, would only come upstairs if I carried her. And even then, she'd sit facing the door, ignoring me completely. If I left the door open, she'd dart down the stairs the moment she could, much like how she reacted to the basement. None of our cats would sleep upstairs either. One of the most frequent occurrences was what I called ghost cat. At night, after turning off the lights, I'd feel the distinct sensation of an animal jumping onto the bed and walking around, as if looking for a spot to settle. I'd reach out to see which pet had joined me, but there was never anything there. Even after I checked, the feeling of tiny steps on the mattress would sometimes persist. Eventually, I stopped looking and just referred to it as ghost cat. There were also unexplained warm spots. My bed was always made, but a few times, I came upstairs to find an impression, as though someone had been sitting on it. The first time, I just stood there staring at the dip in the mattress before rushing over to touch it. It was warm, as if someone had been sitting there moments before. Along with the warmth came a faint floral scent, light and sweet, though I couldn't identify it. Another time I sat next to the spot, it felt the same. My radio also had its own strange behaviors. I had worked hard one summer to buy a CD player, which was a big deal back then. I listened to the radio every morning while getting ready for school. But sometimes, after I'd turn it off and head to the stairs, it would turn back on. Assuming I hadn't pressed the button fully, I'd go back, turn it off again, and watch the red power light fade. Yet almost as soon as I walked away, it would turn back on. This happened multiple times until, in frustration, I told it, "I'm going to be late. We can listen to music later." After that, it stayed off. Saying something similar seemed to work each time this happened, as if whatever was responsible understood me. Eventually, it stopped altogether. Footsteps were another constant. At night, I'd often hear someone coming up the stairs. At first, I assumed it was my dad, as he sometimes said he preferred using the upstairs bathroom. But I never heard the bathroom door close or the toilet flush. One night, curiosity got the better of me and I got up to check. From my doorway, I could see the bathroom door, completely shut, no one inside. The footsteps continued, and I stopped bothering to check after a while. One particularly unnerving experience happened during a bout of insomnia. I often woke up at exactly 3 a.m. and knew I wouldn't fall back asleep until morning, so I'd get up and pass the time writing or drawing. One night, as I lay on the floor listening to music, I heard the footsteps again. They came up the stairs, paused at the top, and went back down. Then they came up again and went down once more. I hoped it was Weenie, but when I checked over the side of the bookshelves, there was no sign of her. I went back to my doorway, watching, but no one appeared. The sound of footsteps continued, reaching the top before descending again. Finally, I shut the door between the two rooms. That moment stuck with me. It felt too deliberate, too real. My dad experienced similar things. He often asked me, "Were you rolling around in your room today?" When I said no, he explained that he'd heard footsteps upstairs, even though the house was empty. He said it happened more than once, and every time he went up to check, there was no one there. I heard the same footsteps during quiet afternoons when I was home alone, expecting to find one of our pets. But I never found anything. These were just some of the experiences I had in the upstairs of that house. Looking back, I can't explain most of what happened, but it left an impression on me. That house was a strange place, and while I've since moved on, the memories of those years still linger. I moved into my current apartment in the fall of 2013. It's a unique space, situated in the basement of a house that has been converted into a business. The setup is a bit unconventional. The living room takes up the entire right side of the apartment and is quite large, while the two bedrooms are on the left side. One bedroom has just one window, and the other has two. The rest of the apartment, including the kitchen and bathroom, is situated between these areas. My bedroom is the larger of the two, and it felt comfortable from the start. However, within a few weeks of moving in, I began noticing strange occurrences in my room. Items would move from one place to another, sometimes vanishing entirely only to reappear later in a completely different part of the apartment. I'd come home to find my bed unmade, the television turned on, or small objects misplaced. At first, I thought my roommate might be playing practical jokes, but he denied it. Eventually, it happened at a time I knew he wasn't home, and I started to believe him. I set up a hidden camera, hoping to catch whatever or whoever was responsible. But every time something happened, I'd find the camera turned off, with no footage recorded. After a few months, the activity stopped completely, at least for a while. Then, one night as I sat in bed watching television, it felt as though something small, like a cat or dog, had leapt onto the end of my bed. I looked down and saw the unmistakable depressions in the blanket, as if invisible paws were walking across it. The animal settled beside me. It was strange but not frightening. For the next few nights, the same thing happened. But on the fourth night, after the presence settled, it got up, walked back to the foot of the bed, and then leapt off. What happened next left me stunned. My comforter was pulled off the bed and flung across the room. What made this more bizarre was that I had my laptop on the comforter along with my remote and phone. Yet none of those items were disturbed. They stayed exactly where they were, as if the comforter had moved without touching anything on top of it. After picking up the blanket and placing it back on the bed, the same thing happened 2 more times until I finally blurted out, "Okay, this is enough. No more." To my surprise, it stopped immediately. At first, I wondered if this was just a one-time event, but it wasn't. Since then, the comforter has been pulled off my bed at least twice a week, sometimes more. Alongside this, other odd things began happening. The television would suddenly turn on or off by itself, movies would rewind or fast forward, and my lamp would flicker on and off. When my boyfriend and I first started dating, I told him about these occurrences, but he didn't believe me. That changed after he stayed over a few times. One night, he experienced it for himself. The comforter was pulled off the bed right in front of him. At first, he was startled and spooked, but over time, he realized that I wasn't afraid, and nothing harmful ever happened. Eventually, he became used to it and even moved in with me. Interestingly, the ghost, as we've come to call it, is respectful. If we specifically ask it to leave us alone, it obliges and doesn't bother us. Its behavior has never felt malevolent, and neither of us feel threatened. Even the dogs seem completely unfazed by its presence. My roommate, however, had a very different reaction. The strange happenings unnerved him to the point that he eventually moved out. To this day, he refuses to set foot inside my apartment again. Living with the ghost has become part of our daily life. It's an unusual situation, but as long as it continues to respect our boundaries, we've learned to coexist peacefully. In the fall, I found myself driving through Montana, traveling from Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota to catch a flight in Billings the following afternoon. Late in the day, I came upon the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Historic Site, also known as Custer's Last Stand or Greasy Grass Creek. I hadn't planned to stop there, though I had seen it on the map. With plenty of time to spare and the site still open, I figured, why not? My first stop was the graveyard near the visitor center. I remember thinking, this is it? It seemed unremarkable at first. But after stepping inside the visitor center, I learned that I could drive across the rolling hills to visit pull-offs where the infamous battles had taken place. With time for a few stops before the park closed, I headed off in my rental car. At the first overlook, I parked and walked to the viewing area, keeping my eyes fixed on the ground as I went. When I looked up at the hills, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Soldiers and native people engaged in battle. I could see them so vividly. Cavalrymen clashing with warriors on foot and horseback. The scene was alive, like I was watching history unfold in real time. Startled, I shook my head back and forth, almost instinctively, as if trying to snap myself out of a daydream. When I looked again, the vision was gone. I told myself it was nothing and continued examining the graves and the landscape, pushing the experience to the back of my mind. At the next overlook, it happened again. Once more, I had been looking down as I walked, thinking little of anything, when I glanced up to take in the view. This time I saw a different battle. Men on horseback and foot fought fiercely with guns and hand weapons. The vision faded as I stood there, rooted to the spot. By then, the park was closing and I had to leave. I had planned to drive closer to Billings and camp there before my flight, but after what I had just experienced, I couldn't bring myself to leave. I found a nearby campsite and resolved to return to the battlefield the next morning. At dawn, I was at the gate, waiting for the park to open. As soon as it did, I drove to the farthest overlooks. At every stop, the same thing happened. I saw battles unfolding, each one unique from the last. Soldiers and warriors engaged in brutal, chaotic combat, and I could almost feel the tension in the air. By then, I had stopped questioning it and was simply observing. Why was I seeing these things? Later that morning, I decided to explore the nature trail behind the visitor center. I had some time to spare before leaving for my flight, and I wanted to photograph wildflowers and maybe spot a rattlesnake, something I enjoy identifying and photographing. As I walked along the trail, stopping to capture the beauty of the landscape, I suddenly hit what felt like an invisible wall. I couldn't move forward. My body refused to take another step. I was gripped by an overwhelming sense that I was surrounded by the dead. Though I saw no marked graves, I felt certain there were bodies everywhere. I tried to rationalize it. You're being silly. Of course there are unmarked graves here. It's a battlefield. That thought seemed to release me, and I was able to continue walking. When I reached the end of the trail, I came upon a kiosk. It explained that this area had been the site of one of the deadliest battles, and indeed, there were unmarked graves throughout. I thought, well, there you go. I regretted having to leave but had a flight to catch. The experience stayed with me, lingering in my mind like a heavy, unshakable presence. Years later, at a native Sundance in southeast South Dakota, I had the opportunity to speak with an elder. I told him about what I had experienced at Little Bighorn and another similar encounter at Canyon de Chelly in Arizona. I asked why I seemed to have so many experiences at native sites and reservations. He listened carefully before telling me, "You're meant to be a bridge between native people and non-natives." His words resonated deeply, and though I'm still exploring what they mean, they've given me a sense of purpose and understanding for the experiences I've had. In 2007, I was traveling from the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota to Billings, Montana, to catch a flight. I'd been solo camping and hiking for 3 weeks, and somewhere along the drive, I realized I was nearing the site of the Battle of the Greasy Grass, also known as the Battle of Little Bighorn. It wasn't part of my plan, but with over an hour before the gates closed and plenty of time before I needed to reach Billings, I decided to stop and explore. I started at the graveyard near the visitor center. Walking among the markers, I thought, wow, this is it? From there, I went inside the visitor center and learned I could drive a scenic route to overlooks where the battles had occurred. The road was dotted with markers indicating where native warriors and cavalrymen were buried. With about 45 minutes until closing, I set off in my rental car. At the first overlook, I walked with my head down, watching my steps as I approached the edge. When I looked up, I was struck by an unbelievable sight, a battle unfolding before me. I saw native people on foot, cavalrymen both on horseback and on foot. Both sides had guns, but I also noticed native warriors wielding bows. It was vivid, almost surreal. Startled, I shook my head like a wet dog, and just like that, the scene vanished. What the heck was that? I thought, but I brushed it off as I explored the markers and admired the rolling hills. Strange things happen to me sometimes, but I've learned not to dwell on them. At the next overlook, I kept my head down again as I walked. When I looked up, I saw another battle different from the first. It lasted only a minute or so before dissipating. The same thing happened at one more overlook before the park closed for the evening. Now I was intrigued. Instead of heading toward Billings as planned, I found a nearby campsite so I could return to the battlefield the next day. The following morning, I waited at the gate for the park to open. As soon as it did, I set off to visit all 12 overlooks. At each stop, I witnessed a different battle. It was like the land itself held onto the memory of these events, replaying them for those willing or able to see. With time to spare before heading to Billings, I decided to explore the nature trail behind the visitor center. I enjoy photographing wildlife, especially snakes and wildflowers, so I took my camera and started down the path. As I walked, I suddenly felt as if I'd hit an invisible brick wall. I couldn't move forward. An overwhelming thought struck me. There are dead people everywhere. I stopped and looked around, but I didn't see any markers. I told myself I was being foolish, just letting my imagination run wild, and managed to continue walking. At the end of the trail, I found a kiosk. It explained that this spot had been the site of the deadliest battle, with countless bodies buried in the surrounding area. Because of the terrain, many had never been excavated. Well, there you go, I thought. The overwhelming feeling I'd had suddenly made sense. I haven't had the chance to return to the battlefield, but I'd like to one day. I'd pay closer attention to the details of the battles I saw and see if the experience repeats itself. Over the years, I've had similar experiences on native land, and it's something I've learned to accept. I once shared this story, along with another from Canyon de Chelly in Arizona, with an elder during a native Sundance in South Dakota. He told me I was meant to share these experiences to help bridge the gap of understanding between native people and others. His words have stayed with me, giving these moments a deeper meaning. I've been thinking a lot about this story lately, and it might help explain some things. It involves my youngest daughter, whom I refer to as JC in my stories. JC is 17 now, and we've recently talked about the things she saw when she was younger and how she still sees things today. She told me she's gotten better at ignoring them, but the things she saw during her elementary school days still haunt her the most. I don't usually see things myself. I'm more auditory. I hear voices, conversations, and can often sense a presence nearby. To avoid it, I almost always keep noise on if I'm alone, whether it's the radio, singing loudly, or even talking out loud to myself. Here's the story. When I delivered JC, she was my second child. My husband couldn't stay at the hospital with me since we had another child at home. On the second night, I was beyond exhausted. JC was in the NICU after complications at birth. When she was born, she wasn't breathing. The doctors couldn't agree on why. One said she was premature, another suggested a collapsed lung, and yet another thought it was pneumonia. They put her in the NICU to treat her for the latter two possibilities. Alone in my hospital room, I just wanted to sleep, but I kept hearing voices in the hallway. They were loud, talking and laughing, and it annoyed me to no end. My door was open, and I wanted it closed so I could rest. Getting out of bed after a cesarean was painful, but I hobbled to the door, determined to give a dirty look to whoever was making all that noise. As I reached the door and peeked into the hallway, the noise abruptly stopped, like someone had flipped off a switch. The hallway was empty, completely silent. No voices, no laughter, not even the usual bustle from the nurse's station. It was eerie. I looked both ways, but there was no one. Frustrated and confused, I left the door open just a crack and climbed back into bed. As I started to drift off, A nurse suddenly rushed into my room and went straight into the bathroom. She didn't say anything to me, didn't even look at me, and didn't turn the light on. I watched her, stunned, then looked at my door. It hadn't moved. It was still only open a crack. The bathroom was silent. No sound of water or movement. I kept staring at the bathroom door, and that's when I noticed two more figures in the room. At the foot of my bed stood a nurse and a man who appeared to be some kind of clergy. They were whispering to each other, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. Their clothes were off. The nurse wore an old-fashioned, starched uniform complete with the small cap, and the man's clothing looked equally outdated. They kept glancing at me and whispering, which irritated me more than it scared me. Finally, I spoke up. "What are you talking about? Are you talking about me?" "What?" At that moment, something behind me shouted a single word. I couldn't make it out, but it sounded like drugs. The voice was loud and odd, and it startled me so much that I twisted sharply to look. That was a mistake. I felt a sharp pain in my stitches and panicked, thinking I'd torn them. Of course, there was nothing behind me, just the wall where my bed was. When I turned back, the two figures were gone, and the bathroom was still eerily silent. I hesitated, debating whether to call the nurse, but what could I say? "There are ghosts in my room. Please get rid of them?" Instead, I checked my stitches. Thankfully, they were fine. And finally, the room felt empty enough for me to get some sleep. I didn't process what had happened until the next day. I hesitantly told my husband about it, and he wasn't surprised. He knows I've dealt with things like this before. He told me he wished he'd been there because he believes he keeps things like that away. Sometimes I think he might be right. I was relieved to leave the hospital and go home. The experience wasn't exactly terrifying, except for the voice behind me, but it was unsettling. I've stayed overnight in other hospitals since, and while I've had a few minor experiences, nothing has been as intense as that night. I have a procedure coming up soon that's supposed to require an overnight stay, but I've convinced my doctor to let me go home the same day. I'm hoping it stays that way. I'd rather not deal with whatever might be lurking in the hospital halls again. This past spring, my husband and I moved into a new apartment. We had just gotten married and needed a bigger place that was also pet-friendly for our small blonde and white Pomeranian, who was like a child to me. At first, everything seemed completely normal. If someone had told me the apartment was haunted, I would have laughed. Our apartment is laid out with a kitchen as you first walk in, leading to the living room and a small hallway that connects 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. We also have neighbors on one side and 2 tenants living above us. A few weeks after moving in, I ran into one of our upstairs neighbors while getting the mail. We chatted for a bit and he asked how we liked the apartment. I told him it was great, no issues at all. Then he said, "That's a relief. The last tenants, some girl and her boyfriend, moved out because they thought it was haunted. But I'm pretty sure they were just on too many drugs and throwing wild parties." He laughed, and I didn't think much of it at the time. Later, I told my husband about the conversation, and he shrugged it off too. He's not much of a believer in ghosts and insists on seeing something himself before he believes. The first incidents. At first, small things started happening, mostly when I was alone. I'd put something down only to find it moved to another spot. It made me feel like I was losing my mind. One time, I was filing my nails when I got a phone call. I left the nail file on the arm of the couch to grab my phone, which was charging in the kitchen. When I came back, the nail file was on the other side of the room, positioned upright on the carpet. I tried dropping it and tossing it to see if it could have landed like that, but it didn't seem possible. Then came the disappearing spatula. One evening, my husband called me at work asking where the spatula was. It wasn't in its usual drawer or the dishwasher, and I told him I'd look when I got home. When I arrived later that night, we both searched the apartment thoroughly. It was nowhere to be found. Frustrated, we gave up and went to bed. The next morning, I opened the drawer to make breakfast, and there it was. I screamed for my husband, who dismissed it as me forgetting where I'd put it. But I knew better. This was just the start of the strange happenings. The scratching and footsteps. One Thursday night, I was home alone watching a movie with my dog asleep in my lap. Suddenly, I heard a light scratching noise behind me. like someone running their nails across the back of the couch. I froze and looked at my dog, who was awake and staring intently behind my head, as if someone were standing there. My heart raced, and I jumped up, grabbing my dog and deciding it was the perfect time for a walk. I didn't tell my husband about it because I knew he'd brush it off as my imagination. Another night, I woke up around 4 a.m. and heard small footsteps in the bathroom, like a dog or cat pacing back and forth. Confused, I looked at the foot of the bed and saw my dog snoring soundly. The footsteps continued for a few minutes before stopping abruptly. When I told my husband about it the next day, he looked puzzled but still chalked it up to me being overworked. The box fan incident. A few nights later, during a thunderstorm, the power went out while I was home alone. I lit some candles and sat in the living room with my phone. Suddenly, the box fan in our bedroom tipped over with a loud crash. My dog went berserk, barking like crazy. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check, but there was no reason for the fan to have fallen. It had been in the same spot since we moved in. I stood it back up and said out loud, "Please stop." When my husband came home, I told him about it. He laughed and said the thunder must have jolted it, though I insisted there hadn't been any thunder at the time. My husband's experience. The next morning, my husband admitted he'd had a strange experience during the night. Around 3 a.m., he'd gotten up to use the bathroom and heard what sounded like feet moving in the bathtub. Grabbing a baseball bat from the closet, he turned on the light and flung the shower curtain open, but the tub was empty. He felt ridiculous and told me he hadn't slept well, trying to figure out what it could have been. For the first time, he seemed to be taking things a little more seriously. The final incident. The following night, we were both home and decided to turn in early. Everything was eerily quiet. No crickets, no traffic, nothing. Around midnight, I woke to a loud bang. My dog jumped off the bed, barking, and my husband bolted upright. The box fan had fallen over again, this time with no explanation whatsoever. My husband, now visibly annoyed, yelled about how it was impossible for the fan to fall on its own. I couldn't help but laugh. "You're the one who said there's no ghost," I teased. He just muttered something under his breath and got back into bed. Reflection. Since the fan incident, things have quieted down again. I still don't know if we're dealing with a ghost, but the odd occurrences have me wondering. My cousin suggested it could be my grandmother, who passed away shortly before we moved in, but it feels more playful than anything else. Maybe it's a ghost cat. Something explains the footsteps and the scratching. As for the spatula, that remains a mystery. For the longest time, my daughter has refused to stay in a room by herself. It's been going on for about a year now, and I was at my wit's end, considering taking her to a therapist to see if they could help. About a month ago, she finally told me why. We were staying the night at my mother's house when she first opened up. My daughter said she went into the kitchen where the light was on, and as she looked at the door leading to the back porch, she saw a black figure with a hat staring at her. I tried to clarify, asking, "Sis, are you sure? Was it just a quick glance?" She shook her head and said no, it wasn't quick. She stared back at it for a full minute, watching to see if it would do anything before running away. Then she revealed something even more chilling. About a year ago, after we moved to a new house about an hour and a half from where we used to live, she started seeing things. One of the first was a grayish figure of a man who walked to the hallway by the bathroom, sat down on the floor, and stared at the window. Her descriptions were vivid and detailed, and as she talked about these encounters, she broke down in tears, trembling with fear. Here are the most serious incidents that have happened recently. 1. The dark man at the doorway. It was raining, and my daughter told me she doesn't like the rain because she feels like something is watching her when it storms. I had just given her a bowl of ice cream and gone to my room, thinking nothing of it. About 25 minutes later, she came to me, trembling and calling, "Mommy!" Her voice was shaky, and she nearly dropped her ice cream. When I asked what was wrong, she said there was a dark man standing in the doorway, staring at her. The hallway light was on, as well as a lamp in my room, so there was no chance it was just a shadow. I told her not to be afraid and asked if he was still there. She nodded and said yes. I instructed her to tell it to leave, and I did the same. As soon as we spoke, she cried harder and told me it had replied, saying, "What?" in a deep voice. 2. The white figures and the woman in black. Another time, she was in the living room with her dad nearby. He noticed something was off. She was standing completely still, staring at the hallway. Later, she told me she had seen 3 white triangular shapes, one after the other, moving from the hallway into the kitchen. When she blinked, a woman in white appeared no more than 4 feet away, silently watching her. When she blinked again, the woman was gone, replaced by a woman in black standing near the bathroom. Then she saw a dark arm come down over the woman in black, as if striking her. Through tears, my daughter told me she felt the women wanted her help, but she was too frightened to do anything. 3. The orbs and the shadows. The most recent incident was especially disturbing. My daughter was alone in the living room while I was in another room. She called for me, and when I came in, tears were streaming down her face. She said everything felt chaotic, like she was losing her mind. She had seen 2 white orbs floating into the kitchen, followed by 3 shadows. One went behind the love seat, another behind the couch, and the third stayed by the side of the couch as if hiding. Then she heard a female voice call her name. When she didn't respond, a male voice called her name instead. She tried telling them to leave her alone, but they wouldn't. She felt something touch her shoulder and her knee, and her leg began shaking uncontrollably. I know she was trying to stay brave because I've always told her to stand her ground, but she was terrified. Elena will turn 9 at the end of the month, and as her birthday approaches, these incidents are happening more frequently. She's an only child, and I know she isn't lying. She's always been truthful, and when she does fib, it's easy to tell. When she's crying, it's serious. She rarely cries otherwise. We bought our house about 2 years ago, and shortly after moving in, we realized we weren't the only occupants. At first, it was just little oddities, things being moved around or doors shutting when we had left them open. We didn't think much of it at the time. The first significant event happened one evening when my husband, D, went to bed. Our daughter, whom we lovingly call the monster, was already tucked in, and I was the only one still awake. Our dog was with me in the office, just to clarify. D got up, opened the door, went to the kitchen, turned around, and came back. He poked his head into my office and asked, "Did you put the dog in the bedroom or let him out?" I said no, confused. He looked shaken and explained that he'd heard the sound of a large dog circling and plopping onto the floor in the bedroom. He assumed it was our dog, Cody, and called his name, expecting Cody to come over. But when there was no response, he got up, warning the dog not to trip him as he went for the light switch. When he turned on the light, there was no animal in the room. Both the monster and I have always been sensitive to the paranormal. Although my husband believed in such things, he hadn't experienced much himself, until we moved into this house. Now he's had his fair share of encounters. We figured out that Sam, our ghostly dog, was introducing himself and had taken a liking to my husband. The next peculiar event involved funnels. Yes, funnels. Our house is about 45 years old and, while in decent shape, had a few quirks. For example, some cabinet doors didn't align properly. One day, after a particularly loud complaint from my husband about the house, the entire set of funnels disappeared. We tore the house apart looking for them. A few months later, while unpacking boxes we hadn't touched in over 10 years, since D's military days, we found the funnels inside one of the boxes. That was when we began to suspect a mischievous presence tied to the house. Over time, we noticed various phenomena. Voices in the basement, phantom footsteps, and even occasional appearances of Sam, a medium-sized golden retriever, and a mysterious cat who hasn't shared her name with us yet. Once, sitting on the patio, we both heard a voice from inside the house saying, "Ho, anyone home?" But when we investigated, the house was empty. On another occasion, I was unwell and lying in bed. I saw a shimmer approach and felt a comforting hand on my forehead. Instantly, my migraine dulled, and I drifted off into a peaceful sleep. My husband, who was nearby, saw nothing, but I knew it wasn't my imagination. Our ghostly visitors seem more protective than malevolent. We've laughed while watching Cody play tag with Sam, who appears as a shimmering outline. However, some moments have been startling, like feeling an invisible animal brush past your leg at night. Items often disappear only to reappear in the most unexpected places, like my phone charger that went missing for 2 weeks and reappeared on my desk in plain sight. Not all encounters have been as lighthearted. One visitor, whom we call the Shadow Man, has a darker presence. He manifests as a tall, thin figure with short hair, wearing 19th century style clothing. His steps are heavy, and his presence is accompanied by an oppressive feeling. He doesn't seem to target us specifically but exudes anger and frustration. One night, Dee experienced the Shadow Man firsthand. He felt an icy, numbing sensation on his face while walking through the hallway. This only occurred in the hallway, and as soon as he entered another room, the feeling disappeared. After repeating this a few times, we addressed the entity directly, asking it to stop, and it did. Despite these unsettling experiences, we've learned to coexist peacefully. We even suspect some of the animals buried in the yard might be among our visitors. A medium once told us that a dog, cat, and bird were connected to the property. And though the bird has yet to make an appearance, Sam and the cat have become part of our unusual family. As we work on the house, we've noticed a connection between our activity and the increase in paranormal events. For example, while painting the hallway one evening, I felt as though unseen eyes were watching me the entire time. Another time, after I baked cookies, the house felt lighter, as if our elderly male visitor enjoyed the smell. There are quieter moments too, like seeing an indentation on the bed, as if someone had been sitting there, or catching a fleeting glimpse of the ghostly cat. One particularly eerie moment occurred when I felt the warmth left behind by the cat, even though our living cat wasn't in the room. Through it all, our family, both living and spectral, has found a way to coexist. We've come to see the house as a unique blend of history, mystery, and warmth, knowing that our visitors, for the most part, mean us no harm. Their presence has added an unexpected layer of depth to our home, making it unlike any other place we've ever lived. This experience took place in southern Missouri, just north of Springfield, during the spring of 2011. At the time, my husband was living in Wisconsin, about an hour outside of Milwaukee. We had been married for less than a year and were navigating the emotional aftermath of a midterm miscarriage. While we were apart, I moved into an old farmhouse that my mother and stepfather were renting. The house, built in the late 1890s, had not been updated since the 1970s. My stepfather made a few repairs, like replacing the kitchen floor, fixing plumbing issues, and installing a new AC unit. It wasn't long after these renovations that strange things began to happen. There were cold spots, mysterious sounds at night, and an overwhelming feeling of unease in the dining room after dark. I often felt like I was being watched when I was alone in the house. There were sounds of footsteps on the stairs, coughing noises, and the smell of cigarette smoke lingering in the dining room, even though no one smoked. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination, until one particular night changed everything. The Shadow Man. I was lying in bed after a phone call with my husband. My room was dark, except for the occasional light from passing cars that fully illuminated the space. The room had 2 walls almost entirely made of windows, so every car that drove by cast a clear beam of light. My bed was positioned in a corner, allowing me to see the windows as I lay there. That night, I was scrolling on my phone, trying to relax before sleep. A car passed by, its headlights lighting up the room, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the center of my room was a shadowy figure, unmistakable and completely solid in appearance. It looked directly at me. I froze, unable to scream or move. As soon as the light faded, it began to approach me. Summoning every ounce of courage, I snapped out of my paralysis and pushed myself against the wall beside my bed. Just as the last bit of light disappeared, I watched the figure walk across the room, pass through my dresser, and disappear through the wall. Though I never saw the Shadow Man again, I continued to have strange encounters in the house. The whispers and footsteps. One night, I was sitting on my bed with my laptop, surrounded by an eerie silence. The only sound was the occasional click of my mouse. Suddenly, I began hearing faint whispers coming from the old intake vent above my dresser. I knew my parents were asleep. It was almost 4 a.m. I tried to rationalize the sound, but it only grew stranger. Soon, I heard distinct footsteps on the stairs right next to my room. The staircase led to a single room upstairs that was used for storage. There was no reason anyone would be up there. Curious but cautious, I walked into the living room and peered into the dining room, where I thought the sound might be originating. Everything was still, and my parents were fast asleep. I returned to my room, trying to convince myself it must have been an animal on the roof or some other logical explanation. I sat back on my bed, but within minutes, I was overwhelmed by the feeling that someone was standing directly in front of me. My bedroom light was on, so I could see there was no one there, but the sensation was undeniable. The whispers started again, louder this time, as though they were coming from inside the furnace. I strained to make out any words but couldn't understand a thing. Then the energy in the room shifted dramatically. Though I couldn't see anyone or hear more than whispers, it felt as if someone was screaming directly in my face. The air around me vibrated with intensity, and the presence felt hostile, as though it wanted me to leave. Taking action. Fed up, I pushed myself off the bed and shouted, "You know what? I've had enough." Determined to take control, I grabbed the sage I had gifted my stepfather for Christmas. Lighting a leaf, I placed it in a seashell and began walking around the room. As the smoke curled into the corners, I repeatedly chanted, "I fill this room with light and love and cast out all negative energy." After that night, the activity stopped entirely. Though I lived in the house for only 5 months, those months were filled with some of the most intense paranormal experiences I've ever encountered. Looking back, I can't help but feel that the sage and my determination to reclaim my space made all the difference. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Since I was 17 years old, I've experienced strange and unexplained events. Don't get me wrong, I'm not someone who jumps to conclusions. I even wondered if it could all be in my head. To rule out mental health issues, I visited 2 therapists who assured me I was perfectly healthy. I wasn't using drugs, taking medication, or doing anything that might cause hallucinations. It all started with shadows. I'd often see movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I'd look, there was nothing there. This began when I was 16, and at first, I brushed it off, thinking I was tired or that it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. After an eye exam confirmed my vision was fine, I continued assuming fatigue was the culprit. I've always been a logical person, someone who needs evidence to believe in anything. At that time, I didn't believe in ghosts or the paranormal. But at 17, things escalated. My TV began turning on by itself. My bed would shake at random moments, and I'd hear voices, though I could never understand what they were saying. Knocks on my walls became a regular occurrence, sometimes starting far away and gradually moving closer to where I sat, only to abruptly stop. Other times, the knocking would remain in one spot. I tried to explain it away as the house's pipes, but the sounds were entirely different. These experiences started to affect me. I lost sleep and found myself waking up every hour, terrified. I began sleeping with my TV on. It became my nightlight because I was so scared of whatever this was. When I turned 19, I moved across the country, hoping to leave it all behind. But the activity followed me. In my apartment, I'd hear the same knocking sounds. I had 2 cats, and they often stared at things I couldn't see, their eyes following something invisible. Whenever I took pictures or videos, orbs would appear. I researched orbs to make sure it wasn't just dust, but the way they moved matched videos I found online about paranormal phenomena. At 21, I moved to another state to care for my father after he fell ill. The occurrences didn't stop. On several occasions, I was woken in the middle of the night by an incredibly loud banging sound, like a group of people slamming into the walls or jumping off the stairs. My dad and I tried to think of logical explanations, but nothing made sense. While lying in bed, I'd feel light kicks or pressure, as if someone were sitting on the mattress. Sometimes I could feel a presence, but I chose to ignore it. I simply didn't know how to respond. Then came the dreams. They started subtly but soon became more vivid and disturbing. In these dreams, I encountered demons. I don't know how I knew they were demons, but I just knew. One particularly vivid dream stands out. I was lying in bed, and it felt like my entire body was weighed down. Though I could move, it was difficult, as if something was holding me in place. In the doorway, I saw a tall, dark figure, faceless but unmistakably there, watching me. When I woke, I was in the exact same position as in my dream, a position I never sleep in. Over time, these dreams became more frequent. Sometimes the demons hurt me, other times they simply watched. Strangely, I've grown so used to them that they no longer bother me. I've even become accustomed to the knocking sounds around my home. As I write this, I can hear tapping on my closet door. I'm not sure what's happening or why. I haven't taken any action to stop it, as I don't know how. I've reached a point where I've simply chosen to live with it. These experiences have left me questioning reality and convinced me that something beyond us exists. I don't have all the answers, but this is my story. These events have changed my perspective, and I now believe there's more to this world than what we can see. This all started just 8 days ago. Please bear with me as the incidents were brief, but they felt incredibly malicious. In September 2013, I moved from Kansas City, Kansas to Riverside, Missouri, due to an insurance issue. My son Ricky needed medication that cost $4,500 a month in Kansas but only $2 a month in Missouri. It was a no-brainer. I moved into an apartment with my 2 sons, while my husband stayed in our home with our daughters. We split our time between both homes to be together as a family. It wasn't ideal, but it was manageable. The move-in day on September 9th was uneventful, except for one odd thing: the fruit basket. I like it placed dead center on the table, but that day it kept moving. I adjusted it at least 6 times, only to find it mysteriously back in the center each time. Finally, I pushed the table against the wall and slid the basket all the way to the back. When I returned to the empty apartment, the fruit basket had moved again, back to the center. The boys were outside resting, so I knew it wasn't them. It was strange, but I shrugged it off. The first week passed without much incident. My husband and daughters visited over the weekend, and by Sunday evening it was just me and the boys again. That night, around 10:30 p.m., I was sitting on the sofa with my laptop when I heard a man's laugh. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a loud, joyous laugh, as if something had startled it out of him. It lasted about 10 seconds. Startled, I assumed someone was on the balcony. I checked, but there was no one there. None of the neighbors were outside either. Feeling unsettled but brushing it off, I set my alarm on my phone, placed it on a nearby chair to charge, and went to bed. I'm a heavy sleeper, but at 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. Confused, I sat up and listened for the coffee pot, thinking maybe it had turned on. As I stood by the door to check my phone, I caught a streak of movement out of the corner of my eye, heading toward the boys' room. Seconds later, a loud crash and a piercing scream came from their room, followed by that same jovial laugh, this time, right in my ear. Panicking, I ran to their room and found my 13-year-old son, Marcus, sitting in bed, covered in broken toy airplanes. These were the same airplanes that had been neatly lined up on the floor earlier that evening. Somehow they had taken off, crashing into the wall, window, and my son before falling on his head. I didn't mention the laughter to Marcus or Ricky, as I didn't want to scare them further, but I sat in the hallway all night, watching over them. The next morning, I told my husband that the apartment might be haunted. He laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. We spent most of the day at the house and only returned to the apartment around 9 p.m. That night, I woke up again, this time at 5 a.m., to Marcus screaming. I found him on the floor, wrapped tightly in his blanket, crying and begging, "Leave me alone. Please leave me alone." Ricky sat up in bed, confused and groggy, repeatedly asking, "What's going on?" I calmed Ricky down and took Marcus to my room, where he told me what had happened. Marcus said he woke up as he hit the floor, with the blanket wrapped tightly around him and a male voice in his ear saying, "Wake up, I'm going to get you," followed by laughter. Happy, carefree laughter. Marcus doesn't move much in his sleep, and I had never seen him cocooned in a blanket like that before. I let him sleep in my room that night. By this point, I was regretting the move. The incidents didn't stop. Closets and cabinets would open while we were out, and my computer started acting bizarrely. One night, I left it on the kitchen table, working perfectly fine. The next morning, 30 programs were open on the screen. We don't have pets, and my boys were sound asleep. Even stranger, all my lighters disappeared, one by one. I usually lose a few in the couch, but when I went to retrieve them, they weren't there. My entire stash of lighters had vanished. It's now day 8 in the new apartment. We have what I can only describe as a laughing lighter thief, who seems to have a grudge against my 13-year-old son. I can't help but wonder what the rest of the month will bring. It all started as a simple curiosity, watching lights. Over the years, I've seen these mysterious lights often enough that I stopped giving them much thought. Recently, though, while staying at my parents' house in the middle of nowhere for a vacation from Philadelphia, I decided to revisit this strange phenomenon. One quiet evening, I sat outside on the front porch, surrounded by complete darkness, trying to see the lights again. It takes a certain relaxed state of mind to notice them, something I hadn't practiced in a long time. After a few minutes, they appeared. One light hovered over a patch of grass across the road, blinking repeatedly. Another caught me off guard. It was on a bat. That was new. My parents have 6 dogs, and I'd brought my own dog along, making 7. At night, most of them stay in a large fenced backyard. While I sat watching the lights, one of the dogs began barking. Within minutes, all of them joined in, growing louder and more agitated. I tried to stay calm, hoping they'd settle, but the intensity of their barking made it clear something was wrong. That's when I remembered I was sitting alone, outside, in the middle of nowhere. I got up and walked around to the backyard. The dogs were lined up along the fence, barking toward the dark field where farm equipment and an old shed stood. The backyard was dimly lit by a light partly obscured by a maple tree. Beyond the fence, everything was pitch black. I stepped into the yard, feeling safer within the land of the dogs, as I like to call it. Their presence always makes me feel protected. I started talking to them, asking what was wrong, but my entrance seemed to calm them. They disbanded, except for my dog, who stayed by the fence, keeping watch. He's protective of me like that, always positioning himself between me and any perceived threat. But tonight, his hackles were raised, and every now and then, he let out a low warning bark. Curious and a bit uneasy, I walked over to him, peering into the darkness. Then I saw it. Low to the ground, a faint green glow appeared, a sphere about 2 feet in diameter. It wasn't bright but visible enough to reflect off the ground, and even the back wheel and license plate of my car parked nearby. I hadn't been able to see my car in the darkness before, but now its outline was illuminated by the eerie green light. After about 10 seconds, the glow vanished, and my dog stopped barking. I sat back on a bench near the gate, trying to process what I had just seen. My dog, however, stayed alert, barking intermittently. I began to pray, or more accurately, talk to the energy around me. I asked any bad energy to leave and invited good energy to stay. Whether it worked or not, the green sphere reappeared. This time, I saw it rolling across the grass, about 20 feet from my car. By now, I didn't feel fear, just curiosity. It seemed interested in my car, and oddly, my dog only reacted to it when I looked in its direction. He wasn't facing me and couldn't have known when I turned my head. It was as if the light wanted me to see it and deliberately made itself visible when I looked for it. That night left me with more questions than answers. I still don't know what the green light was or why it behaved the way it did. Was it curious? Was it something trying to communicate? All I know is that it felt like a rare glimpse into something beyond our understanding. A fleeting moment shared between me, my dog, and the mysterious green glow. Since childhood, I've always been sensitive to the energies around me, whether they come from people, places, or things. Even as young as 2 or 3 years old, I could sense negative auras, sometimes even from family members. Over the years, I've had many strange experiences, but I've never been scared of this ability. It's always felt like a part of me. As I've grown, I've even found comfort in it. Recently, my husband, son, and I moved after spending 2 years living in a 1916 ranch house in Springfield, Missouri. The house was beautiful, with a basement, a huge backyard, and an upstairs loft. As San Diego natives, we were used to apartment living, so this felt like a dream come true. In the first month, life was hectic. Address changes, school arrangements, and settling into the new house kept us busy. But once things calmed down, I started noticing something odd. There was a strange energy upstairs. I brushed it off as the natural creepiness of an old house. To escape my husband's loud snoring, I started sleeping in the upstairs loft, which we had turned into a guest room and play area for my son. His bedroom was also upstairs, but it was a proper room. The first incident happened on my second night there. I woke up to a thunderstorm and was trying to fall back asleep when one of my son's toys suddenly started talking. "Find the letter," it repeated over and over. Annoyed, I crawled out of bed to turn it off, but as soon as I reached it, the noise stopped. I dismissed it as static from the storm. The next morning, I checked all the noisy toys, but none of them made the voice I had heard. That was my first clue that something wasn't normal. On another night, I decided to let one of our dogs sleep upstairs with me, thinking it might help ease my nerves. Around the 5th or 6th night, as I lay facing the wall, I heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. Thinking it was my husband coming to say goodnight, I waited. I felt him lean close to me, but when I turned around for my usual goodnight kiss, I saw a figure standing there. Before I could react, it vanished. My dog sat up straight, growling and staring at the exact spot where the figure had been. The next morning, my husband told me he had fallen asleep on the couch and never came upstairs. If you were downstairs in that house, you could often hear footsteps or even muffled conversations coming from upstairs. I always felt like something was watching me whenever I passed the bottom of the stairs. One day, I spoke to the energy directly, telling it firmly but kindly, "This isn't your house anymore. We live here now. You can stay, but only if you live in peace with us." After that, the energy in the loft seemed to calm and become more peaceful. However, my son's room was a different story. The energy there felt dark and unwelcome. My husband and I would take turns checking on my son at night, but we both dreaded going into his room. I would rush through the check as fast as possible and leave because I could feel that whatever was there didn't want me around. My son, however, seemed perfectly comfortable in his room, completely unaffected by the presence. On one occasion, a close friend babysat for us. She told me later that a toy had been thrown down the stairs with surprising force. She hadn't mentioned it at first, but when I shared my feelings about the house's energy, she admitted it had scared her. We eventually found a wonderful college student from MSU to babysit for us. She adored my son and was fantastic with him. But one evening, when we returned home, she was pale and anxious to leave. She said she had heard strange noises upstairs while one of our dogs growled at the bottom of the stairs. Thinking it was our cat causing trouble, she went to check, only to find the cat asleep on the couch. After that night, she stopped responding to our calls and texts. Later, her boyfriend told us she had been genuinely frightened during her last visit. Over time, we got used to the strange noises and unsettling energy in the house. But the house itself was falling apart. Floors caving in, systems failing, and we decided it was time to move. On my last visit to collect the remaining items, I felt an overwhelming negative energy. It was angry, as if whatever was in the house resented us leaving. I grabbed what I needed and left as quickly as possible, never looking back. Interestingly, after moving into our new home, just a block away, I became pregnant within 2 weeks. We had been trying for 2 years with no success while living in the old house. Our new home felt welcoming and peaceful from the moment we arrived, as if we were meant to be there. Whenever I drive past the old house, I still get a chill. It feels empty, lonely, and angry, as if something is waiting for its next occupants. Our neighbors later told us that no one ever stays in that house for long, and it often sits vacant for years at a time. In 2009, I bought my first house in the Waldo area of Kansas City, Missouri. It was a modest 3-bedroom, 1-bath ranch, built in 1953 and spanning about 1,100 square feet. I bought it from the original owner, a sweet elderly woman who was moving in with her daughter. Though I never met her, everyone described her as kind. The house itself was dated but in good condition, perfect for a first home. The day I took possession of the house, my significant other, our dog, and I went over to start cleaning. When we got to the basement, something strange happened. Our terrier, usually fearless and curious, stopped at the top of the stairs. He stood there, facing a corner just to the left of the basement stairs, and began growling, a low, steady growl. From that day on, no matter what, he refused to set foot in the basement. For a dog that jumps headfirst into every situation, this was completely out of character. A few months later, we decided to pull up all the carpets in the house after discovering that some dog treats didn't agree with our pup. The hardwood floors were in great shape except in one room, the second largest bedroom. The finish on the floor was completely worn down in a path from the door to the window on the opposite wall, as though someone had paced back and forth there endlessly. One night, after a fight with my partner, I decided to sleep in that room. In the middle of the night, I woke up to see a dark shape standing beside the bed, a shadowy figure of a person. I closed my eyes, hoping I was imagining it, and when I reopened them, it was gone. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Gathering my courage, I left the room and never slept there again. About 2 years into living in the house, we experienced another strange event. We went down to the basement to do some laundry, and there, right in our path to the washing machine, stood an antique pill bottle. The bottle looked like something from the 1960s or 70s, with its label worn away. The basement was unfinished, and we had swept the floor countless times over the years. We walked that path almost daily, yet neither of us had ever seen the bottle before. The sudden appearance baffled us. Another time, while I was home alone, I experienced something even more unsettling. I had just placed a load of laundry in the washing machine and was halfway up the basement stairs when I clearly heard someone say, "What are you doing?" The voice was unmistakably human. The house was silent. No TV, no radio, and no one else inside. The clarity of it ruled out the possibility of the sound coming from outside. I was completely alone. In 2012, I was offered a job in another city, and we needed to sell the house. As we packed, I realized how much we had accumulated in just a few years. Every closet, the garage, and most of the basement were packed full, except for the corner near the basement stairs. The same corner our dog had growled at on the first day. That area, the driest and most convenient part of the basement, had remained untouched. It was as though we had unconsciously avoided it for 3 years, only going there for maintenance when absolutely necessary. Reflecting on our time in the house, it never felt like it belonged to us. It always felt like we were intruding in someone else's space, like unwelcome guests. I looked into the house's history but found no records of anything tragic or unusual happening there. Yet the feeling lingered. Now, we live in a new house in a new city. It's similar to the old one, but there's a sense of warmth and welcome here that we never felt before. Interestingly, the previous owners of this house loved dogs so much they created a small pet cemetery in the backyard. Despite that, the energy here is positive, and even our dog happily ventures into the basement. It's a stark contrast to the unease we felt in our old home, a place that never truly felt like ours. In most of my paranormal experiences, I've never noticed anything truly bad happening to me because of them. Sure, I've had the occasional nightmare, but nothing emotionally scarring. That said, I often find myself reflecting on those moments, especially the one I'm about to share. It happened when I was about 14 or 15 years old. At the time, I had just moved downstairs into our basement. My older sister had recently had her first child. He was about 6 or 7 months old, and was still living with me and my mom while attending college. My new room was cozy but dark, and the basement itself always had an unsettling vibe, like I was being watched. To make it less creepy, I had a small artificial tree decorated with white Christmas lights, which served as a night light. I also left the stairway light on because the darkness outside my room made me uneasy. Even now, I still get chills whenever I go down there. This particular experience happened around midnight. I had been asleep when I felt something gently tickling my toes. It was such a light sensation that it woke me up. Groggily, I looked toward the door and saw what I thought was my father. He was standing partially behind the door, with only half of his body visible. The door was halfway closed, as I always kept it that way to block out the shadows beyond. At the time, I didn't question why my dad might be there. I simply assumed he had come home early from work and stopped by to say hello before heading upstairs to bed. Still half asleep, I smiled and got out of bed to greet him. But as I walked toward the door, he tilted his head slightly, almost as if he were curious about me. The figure looked a lot like my dad, tall, tan, with short white hair, wearing overalls and a red t-shirt. But something felt off. Before I could reach the door, the figure seemed surprised and quickly floated backward behind it. He didn't step or move his legs, he just glided out of view. Confused, I opened the door all the way, but there was no one there. I peered into the darkness of the basement, lit faintly by the stairway light, and thought I heard the faint sound of an older man chuckling. That's when the fear hit me. My adrenaline kicked in, and I slammed the door shut, scurrying back to bed as fast as I could. I dove under the covers, my heart racing. As I lay there, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, I felt a gentle touch on my hair, like the comforting gesture of a father trying to calm his child. That feeling was so soothing that, despite everything, I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day, my dad came home from his job. That's when it really hit me. There was no way the figure I saw could have been him. I've often wondered why some of the entities I've encountered resemble family members. Is it deliberate? A trick to make me lower my guard? I still don't know. Even now, I think back to that night in the basement. It wasn't terrifying in a traditional sense, but the memory lingers, leaving me with questions I may never have answers to. It was my sister's senior year of high school and I was in 8th grade. That night, she had an unusual assignment. She needed to visit a local cemetery, take pictures of graves, and write a poem inspired by one of the headstones. The poem didn't have to be factual, just based on the grave she chose. So my mom, my sister, her boyfriend, and I all piled into my dad's truck and drove to a cemetery just outside of town. It was around 9 p.m., and the night was pitch black with no moonlight to guide us. If you've never been to a cemetery at night, I dare you to try. The atmosphere is heavy, eerie, and unsettling, made even worse by the fact that the truck's headlights were our only source of light, casting long shadows over the graves. At the time, I'd had 1 or 2 encounters with ghosts, so the whole setting put me on edge. When we arrived, my sister and her boyfriend got out of the truck and began walking among the graves. My mom slowly drove along the cemetery's narrow road, trailing them as they searched for inspiration. I stayed in the truck, unwilling to step out into the darkness. We stopped at a grave with a statue of an angel. It stood with its arms open, gazing down as though it were waiting to embrace someone. My sister was captivated by it, but I was completely freaked out. In the beam of the headlights, the angel seemed almost alive, its gaze fixed on my sister, as though it were waiting for her to get closer. My skin crawled. As we drove further, I began to notice something even more terrifying. From the corner of my eye, I saw a black shadow dart out from behind a grave and vanish into the darkness. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, until more shadows began to appear. They moved just beyond the reach of the headlights, visible enough to see their shapes but not their details. My sister claimed to have seen them too, and she described their faces as pale and lifeless, with dark, empty holes for eyes and mouths. Despite the unease, my sister needed to finish her assignment, so we pressed on. My mom, who hadn't noticed anything unusual, continued driving slowly through the cemetery. Then, something happened that I'll never forget. A shadow pressed itself against my window. Its face was horrifying. Eyes like black orbs and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide, like a snake unhinging its jaw. As it opened its mouth, I heard a sound that chilled me to my core, a rattling guttural noise, like something straight out of a horror movie. The air in the truck turned icy in an instant. Just moments earlier, I had been sweating from nerves, but now, I could see my breath in the frigid air. I froze, staring at the shadow in terror. I didn't scream, fearing my mom would think I was hallucinating. After what felt like an eternity, the shadow moved away and vanished into the darkness. As it disappeared, all the other shadows seemed to fade away too. My sister never saw the figure by the truck, but the experience left me shaken. Even after we left the cemetery, I couldn't get the image of that face out of my mind. I had nightmares about it for years. That night felt like it lasted forever. It was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, and even now, I still think about those shadows and wonder what they really were. This experience happened when I was around 14 or 15 years old. My best friend and I met in high school gym class. At first, we didn't get along. She would constantly pester me, and I would ignore her. It was a strange cycle that went on for a while. But eventually, after about a month of her persistence, I gave in, and we became fast friends. Despite being polar opposites in personality, we shared many similar interests and spent as much time together as possible. After I had visited her house a few times, she told me about a spirit they called Charlie. Apparently, her house had been built on a gravesite where a family was buried improperly. No coffins, just bodies thrown into the dirt and covered. From the time her family moved in, they experienced strange occurrences. Objects moving on their own, doors opening and closing randomly, and eerie noises at night. Everyone in the family, including her parents and brothers, had noticed these things. The name Charlie came from an unsettling experience my friend had when she was home alone. After stepping out of the shower, she saw the bathroom mirror steamed up, with the name Charlie written on it. From then on, the family started calling their ghost Charlie. My friend assured me that Charlie had never hurt anyone, though his presence was undeniably creepy. A couple of weeks after hearing about Charlie, I went to her house for a sleepover. We spent the evening doing typical high school stuff, playing video games, eating pizza, and talking late into the night. By 1 a.m., we were exhausted and decided to go to bed. We chatted for a bit longer before falling asleep. What happened next is based on my friend's account, as I don't remember any of it myself. She said she woke up to a strange noise in the room, like a plastic clothes hamper tapping gently against the wall. Concerned, she tried to wake me, but when she looked at me, my eyes were already open. However, I wasn't awake. I seemed to be in a deep sleep or some kind of trance. Here's what she says I spoke. "Who are you? What is your name? What? I can't understand you. Bill." After that, my words became incomprehensible, like gibberish. My tongue sounded loose, as if I was trying to speak but couldn't form proper words. My friend, understandably scared, grabbed her flashlight and turned it on. That's when she noticed something in the corner of the room. Standing there was a man. She described him as tall, with tan skin, wearing a hat and farmer's clothes. He was just staring at her. Terrified, she watched as he mouthed words silently, while I continued to respond in my strange gibberish. After a moment, the man slowly melted into the wall and disappeared. As soon as he was gone, I stopped talking and seemed to fall back into a normal sleep. The next morning, my friend told me everything that had happened. I was completely freaked out. I had never communicated with a spirit before, certainly not through words or whatever gibberish I had been speaking that night. To this day, I still don't know who Bill was. Was he a relative of Charlie, or was he a completely separate entity? I have no idea, but that experience remains one of the strangest and most unsettling moments of my life. Over the past year, my family has been experiencing a series of unsettling and random paranormal events. It all seemed to begin after my mom's boyfriend passed away from cancer. I'm not sure if his death is connected, but the timing makes me wonder. The first major incident happened one night when I woke up to the sound of voices in the house. It was a man and a woman, and their conversation sent chills down my spine. They talked about wearing us, as in wearing our skins. The phrase immediately brought skinwalker or demon to mind. This wasn't the first time I'd heard them, though. On earlier occasions, they'd said things like, "Everyone's asleep," or scolded me for accidentally waking up one of my kids. The things they said started innocently enough but grew progressively more disturbing. Sometimes I can't make out their words, but their presence alone is enough to wake me, and they've woken my kids as well. My children have been deeply affected. They often have nightmares, waking up crying and scared. My youngest refuses to sleep in his room, no matter what we try. He says he's terrified of it, but he can't explain why. There's also been a lot of shadow activity in the house. I frequently see shapes darting around, including what seems to be a mischievous little girl. She runs from the kids' bathroom to my daughter's room. She feels playful rather than harmful, but her presence is unsettling nonetheless. In contrast, I've also sensed a black shadow in my bathroom. This one feels more curious and lonely than threatening. For some reason, I get the impression he's tied to the house, possibly someone who took his own life. While his energy feels sad, there are others I've seen that carry a much darker, more menacing vibe. The most terrifying moment so far involved a demon. One night, I saw something on my porch that looked like the creature from John Henry Fuseli's The Nightmare. At first, it appeared dog-like and came inside, but as I looked closer, its form shifted. I panicked and instinctively started reciting the Lord's Prayer, and as soon as I did, it vanished. When I later searched online, I found the exact image of what I had seen in Fuseli's painting, which only confirmed my fear. Recently, I've been seeing shadow people as well. Unlike ghosts, which I usually perceive as white or ethereal, these figures are pitch black with glowing red eyes. The first time I saw one, the phrase unclean spirit popped into my mind. His presence radiated evil. At first, I thought it might be my mom's deceased boyfriend visiting, as he didn't like me when he was alive, but soon I realized this was something else entirely. Something darker and more sinister, almost as if it were trying to deceive me. These shadow figures have been appearing more frequently than ever, and they bring a heavy, negative energy with them. I've also started experiencing sleep paralysis, which I hadn't dealt with in years. The worst episode occurred when I saw the man in the black hat, a figure that followed me to my in-laws' home. Their house had always felt safe to me, as they're deeply religious Christians, but seeing that entity there was a blow. Felt like there was no escaping this. What troubles me is how these events seem to come in waves. For years, we had nothing strange happen in this house, and then suddenly, after my mom's boyfriend's death, it all began. Things would happen for a while, voices, shadows, strange feelings, and then go quiet, only for something else to occur weeks or months later. Just today, I saw the little shadow girl again, sitting in my bathroom with her legs swinging playfully. It's these moments that remind me how unpredictable this past year has been. A chaotic mix of paranormal activity that seems to target my family at random. I've dealt with paranormal experiences my entire life, but never as frequently or as intensely as now. It's as if something has changed, and I can't help but wonder what's behind it all. It all started with something small. So small, I might have brushed it off if the events that followed hadn't taken such a disturbing turn. I was sitting in the kitchen, enjoying some steak and shake, when I noticed two blue bandanas tied to the pantry cabinet doors. They were moving, blowing upward as if caught in an invisible undercurrent of wind. I assumed it must be the air conditioning or some other natural explanation. My husband was just around the corner, out of sight, blowing his nose. I waited for him to come into the room, thinking he could confirm what was happening. But the moment he walked into the kitchen, the bandanas stopped moving, completely still. I told him what I had seen and asked him to sit and watch with me. If movement in the house caused them to blow, surely they would start again, right? But they didn't. We sat there for 30 minutes, watching and waiting, but the bandanas remained perfectly still. This struck me as odd because they had hung on those pantry handles for 6 months without ever moving, no matter the season or the state of the air conditioning. Why now, and why stop so abruptly? That was just the beginning. A few nights earlier, I had woken up to a woman's voice saying hush loudly enough to wake not just me, but my children as well. My husband, however, slept through it. There was no one else in the house, and I wondered if it might have been sound carrying from outside. But this wasn't the first time we'd heard that voice. On another occasion, it had said something far more terrifying, that it was going to wear our skins. That time, too, it woke both me and the kids. Just 3 days before the bandana incident, I woke up around 2 a.m. to what sounded like distant screaming. I couldn't see my clock because my water cup was blocking it, but I knew it was close to 2 a.m. because my husband, who gets up for work at 2:30, was still asleep. As I lay there, I saw something that chilled me to my core. A face with one eye and shaggy hair peeking at me through the bars of our exercise bike near the bed. Terrified, I prayed and got up to check on the kids, but they were sound asleep. The next morning, I asked my husband to move the exercise bike out of our room. The following night, I woke up again at 2 a.m., feeling like I was being choked. I sat up, able to move but panicked, and found my neck hurting. When I checked in the mirror later, I was horrified to find my neck was bloody right where my cross necklace rests. The chain and cross are smooth, and I have no fingernails to scratch myself with since I bite them. My husband, asleep on the far side of the bed, had nothing sharp on him, and there's nothing in the bed that could have caused those marks. While I was still reeling, I noticed something else. A black, golf ball-sized shadow slowly moving up the wall before it disappeared. Last night was worse. I woke up at 2 a.m. again, the now familiar feeling of choking gripping me. This time, I opened my eyes to see a shadow on the wall above my husband's head. It looked like jagged, triangular hair, like the silhouette of a girl. The shadow moved out over his head before vanishing. Shaken but too tired to stay awake, I lay back down. But as soon as I did, the choking sensation returned. This time it was stronger. I could move, but I felt invisible hands around my neck, squeezing. It only stopped when I called out the name of Jesus Christ. My husband saw the blood on my neck and agrees something is happening. Our kids are also being affected. They've been having constant nightmares. My youngest is scared to stay in his room at night and refuses to sleep there. I believe we're being targeted by something demonic. I've begun taking steps to protect my family and our home. I've prayed throughout the house and am in the process of obtaining holy water. A friend offered to help, but her daughter broke her ankle shortly after I asked for the water, delaying the process. I don't want to push her but hope to have it soon. In the meantime, I've also purchased white sage and have asked my husband to start videotaping any unusual activity. I don't know why this is happening. I only know that it started recently and has escalated quickly. I'm terrified for my family, but I'm determined to fight this. I have 2 experiences I want to share that I personally feel are connected. Lately, they've been on my mind constantly. The first involves a UFO, and the second is tied to native drumming and singing. After sharing these experiences, I'll provide some background about life on the farm, as I feel there are parallels between my story and others who've described similar occurrences. As a kid, I spent every summer on my grandparents' old farm, now called Crane Kettle Farms, near Stockton, Missouri. The farm was in the middle of nowhere. 80 acres of cows, chickens, and plenty of space to roam. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, I was sitting on the front porch with my grandfather and brother, looking out over the farm. Suddenly, beyond the tree line, we noticed what looked like a star. It rose up into the sky, paused, and then shot off like a streaking meteor. We sat there in disbelief, exchanging stunned glances. I was about 10 to 12 years old at the time and didn't fully grasp what I had witnessed, but I knew it wasn't normal. The second experience happened sometime after the UFO sighting. I can't pinpoint how many years later, but it was during the same period of my childhood. My brother, cousin, and I had just finished putting the chickens, ducks, and geese into their pens for the night. As we walked back toward the house, we began to faintly hear the sound of drumming and singing. It was soft at first, like it was coming from far away, but it quickly grew louder. The strange part was we could see for a good distance around us, especially in the direction the sound seemed to come from. Yet we saw nothing. The drumming and singing surrounded us, growing closer and louder until it felt like it was right on top of us. Still, we couldn't see anyone or anything. It was exactly what you'd imagine Native American drumming and singing to sound like: haunting, rhythmic, and otherworldly. I remember seeing my grandmother step out onto the porch, and I immediately bolted toward her. When I glanced back, my brother was shaking my cousin, who had gone pale and stiff with fear. That moment has stuck with me ever since. Years later, I decided to look into the history of the area and learned that it was once Osage territory. This discovery sent me down a rabbit hole of Osage folklore and beliefs. One story that caught my attention was about the Star People, whom the Osage believed came down to guide humans away from their bad ways. This struck a chord with me, as it reminded me of the star we had seen rise beyond the trees and shoot off into the sky. Could there be some truth to their stories? I know what I saw that evening. Another piece of folklore I found intriguing was about drumming spirits. The story, as I recall, goes something like this. There was a time when the youth of the tribe began mocking the traditions of their elders, drumming and singing to make fun of the older generation's sacred rituals. These young ones didn't live honorable lives and, as a result, failed to earn their place in the spirit world. Instead, their spirits were doomed to roam the earth, drumming and singing, forever disconnected from their tribe. It made me wonder, could the drumming we heard have been the restless spirits of those who never earned their way into the spirit world? I also recently learned that people in other states have experienced similar things, so perhaps it isn't exclusively tied to the Osage. Many tribes share similar stories and beliefs, which makes it even more fascinating. Now, a little about the farm itself. It was isolated and serene, the kind of place where a boy could lose himself in the natural world. My brother and I spent our summers there, with only the occasional visit from cousins who might stay a few days before disappearing until the next summer. I spent my days wandering the fields and creeks, catching crawdads, fishing in the pond, or playing with frogs. There was even a cow I could lean against to nap, and she wouldn't get up until I did. It was a beautiful, peaceful place, until the sun set. My mom would sometimes tell us that, as night fell, she could hear drumming and singing off in the distance. At the time, I didn't believe her. But now, after what I've experienced, I know she wasn't making it up. That's my story. These experiences, especially the drumming and the sight of that star-like object, have stayed with me all these years. Over the years, I've had several unusual experiences, and while they might seem small to some, they've left a lasting impression on me. I believe these events might be connected to my grandfather who passed away 5 years ago. Here are a few of those moments. The soap incident. A few years back, my younger sister and I were relaxing on our back patio, listening to music, while our parents were in the garage. Our house has a long hallway with a laundry room in the middle, and I'd make frequent trips inside to grab a snack or drink. I never saw my parents come into the house during this time, or anywhere near the laundry room. Around 10 p.m., we decided to head inside to get ready for bed. I went into the laundry room to grab my clothes from the dryer and noticed something odd. Blue laundry soap was pooled on top of the washing machine and dripping down the front. At first, I assumed the soap container had fallen and spilled. But then I noticed the container sitting upright next to the spill, perfectly positioned as if someone had carefully placed it there. Even stranger, the wooden shelf where the soap is usually kept had soap on it too, as though someone had deliberately poured it out and then set the container down. It was unsettling, but I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I'd somehow missed someone coming in. The cheerful music. Nearly a year ago, on my 19th birthday, something else happened. The night before my birthday was a full moon in Sagittarius, my sun sign, and I decided to spend the evening outside under the moonlight. I found myself thinking about my grandfather and a story my Aunt Amanda once shared about him. She told me that he'd once gone outside, looked through a telescope near our back door, and pointed at the sky. Reflecting on her story, I glanced up, and at that moment, I saw a shooting star. While not paranormal, it felt like a sign, though I couldn't explain why. As midnight approached, I started heading inside when I heard something unusual: cheerful fair music. The sound was coming from a dense portion of the forest near our house, and the only thing beyond it is an old farmer's property. I walked closer, trying to pinpoint the source, but the music neither grew louder nor faded away. It played for about 3 minutes before stopping abruptly. Given that my birthday is near Christmas, I thought it could be related to the holiday, but the timing and location didn't make sense. The TV mystery. The final experience happened about a month ago. I was sitting on the couch around 8 p.m., reading while the TV played in the background. The remote was lying untouched on the cushion next to me. Suddenly, the TV screen went black and switched channels on its own. I glanced at the remote, which was still in the same spot, untouched. Confused, I looked behind the couch and into the hallway, calling out to see if someone was playing a prank. My sister came out of her room asking what I needed, and at the same time my parents walked in from the garage. I sat back down, unsettled, but decided to listen to the music on the channel the TV had switched to. I grabbed the remote to turn up the volume, but after raising it 2 notches, the remote stopped working entirely. To my shock, the volume bar began decreasing on its own until it reached 0. I tried again to switch the channel or raise the volume, but the remote wouldn't respond. 5 minutes later, it started working again as if nothing had happened. A week later, my curiosity got the better of me, and I searched through the TV guide to find the music channel. When I played it, my grandmother overheard and told me it was exactly the type of music my grandfather used to love. This discovery left me amazed and further convinced that these experiences might be connected to him. Each of these moments, though brief, has stayed with me. They make me wonder if my grandfather is somehow watching over us, leaving little signs to remind us of his presence. Whether it's a spilled soap container, cheerful music in the woods, or a TV acting on its own, these experiences are a part of my story, and I hold them close. The first time I recall seeing him, I was around 8 years old. My bed had recently been moved to face the window in my room. It was nighttime, but the outside was well lit. That's when I saw him, a cloaked, black figure with a hood obscuring most of his face. What little I could see of his face was pale, maybe translucent, and appeared to have blood dripping down it. I'm not sure if I'd call him solid, but he was vivid, and I remember every detail. The next time I saw him, I was around 12 or 13. I was sitting in the basement of a different home with a friend, facing her. I blinked, and in my mind's eye, I suddenly saw the basement from her perspective, and there he was, standing behind me in a doorway. Not long after, I visited a small Wiccan shop. The moment I entered, the owner's face drained of color, and she practically ran out of the room. Her husband later explained that she sensed a dark energy surrounding me. At the time, I interpreted this as darkness in my aura. The timeline of events gets a bit foggy from here, but there's one decision I made that I deeply regret. After the basement incident, I decided to use a Ouija board in that same basement, hoping to contact my late uncle. Instead, I believe I opened the door to other spirits, or perhaps gave this entity a stronger foothold. Not long after, I started hearing his voice in my head. I know how crazy that sounds, but it wasn't threatening, at least not at first. He told me his name, though I've since forgotten it, and claimed to be someone connected to one of my past lives. He said that in that life I had committed suicide at 17, and he implied that he was trying to guide or help me. Things took a darker turn, though. I began to fear that he was manipulating me. Desperate to break free, I attempted a binding ceremony. At the time, I was in my early teens and had no idea what I was doing. I'm certain it didn't go as planned. Afterward, the voice stopped. I haven't seen him directly since, but I've felt his presence many times over the years. My husband has caught glimpses of him in every house we've lived in, 5 different locations in total. For a while, he thought it was something following him, but I believe it's tied to me. I've saged our homes, performed cleansing rituals, and done everything I can to remove negative energies, but something always lingers. Last night, everything resurfaced. I was having a conversation with my stepbrother's girlfriend. We barely know each other and haven't spoken much. My mom brought up the Wiccan shop incident, asking what the owner had said to me. When I explained that the owner had been disturbed by my energy, my stepbrother's girlfriend surprised me by saying she didn't think it was my energy. She admitted that when she first met me, she saw a cloaked figure standing behind me. She described him perfectly without ever knowing my story. She even confessed that she had to leave quickly because his presence was overwhelming and intimidating. She added that he seemed to not want anyone near me, and she was terrified to admit that she saw him again last night. Her words shook me, especially since I've tried for years to convince myself he's no longer here. I'm now 26, and this entity has been with me for around 18 years. I've gone back and forth, questioning whether he's malevolent or a misunderstood guiding spirit. Either way, I feel like his presence is holding me back from reaching my full potential. Does anyone have advice or experience with something similar? I believe I may have bound him to me during that poorly executed ceremony, and I'm torn about what to do. Should I release him even if he might be malevolent? I don't want to unleash harm into the world, but I also long to be free of him. Any insight would be deeply appreciated. My life has always been filled with paranormal experiences, starting from when I was very young. I'd often ask my parents if we had ghosts in our house. Their answer was always the same: "We bought the house brand new. No one's died here." I wanted to believe them, but something deep down told me they were wrong. As I got older, I began having horrible, realistic nightmares. They weren't just the typical childhood fears. They felt more vivid and sinister. Some were clearly fueled by a child's imagination, like the evil leprechaun-sized dentist who wanted to kill me, or flying snakes. But others had an eerie, recurring theme. One nightmare stood out. It was my mother's birthday, and I just learned how to read. My grandmother handed me a card to read aloud to show my mom how much I'd improved. I struggled with the words, and the second I finished reading, my mom suddenly died. My grandmother laughed as I cried uncontrollably. The nightmare was so vivid, I woke up screaming, and my dad had to comfort me for what felt like forever. Another recurring nightmare was about a witch who lived in the walls of my grandmother's basement. And then there was the time I'd been watching Blue's Clues in the playroom. I must have fallen asleep because I had a nightmare where a witch came out of the closet and tried to attack me. For reasons I still don't understand, the recurring theme of a witch has haunted my dreams throughout my life. After my parents divorced, I started splitting my time between their homes. My mom's house always felt normal, but my dad's house carried an uneasy energy, especially in the old playroom. I ignored it until one day on my way to school, I had an encounter that stayed with me. As I walked down the hall toward the kitchen, I saw a shadowy figure in the shape of a man. My dad was still at work, and it was far too tall to be my stepmom. Frozen in fear, I decided not to look away. Instead, I tried turning on the lamp beside me, but it wouldn't work. As I stared at the shadow, it began to move, not with the natural bounce of someone walking, but gliding smoothly to the right, disappearing behind the wall. Terrified, I managed to get the lamp on, but the shadow was gone. Against all better judgment, I followed where it had gone, but there was nothing there. I texted my stepmom to ask if she'd been in the kitchen, but she replied that I'd just woken her up. Later, I moved in full-time with my mom and her boyfriend. I thought things would be normal, but it turned out that I was the one haunted. Nothing happened for a while, until one night when I couldn't sleep because of the TV noise. After it was finally turned off, I began to drift off. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a man yell clearly, "Wake up!" Frozen with fear, I waited what felt like an eternity before slowly turning to look behind me, praying not to see anything. There was nothing there. The next day at dinner, I told my mom what happened. Her boyfriend chimed in, saying it might have been his mom's ex, whom she had shot dead in the field outside our house because of his abuse. A year later, while discussing our experiences, my mom told me about her own encounter with a Ouija board. She and her friends had left it to grab beers from the garage, and when they returned, the TV was on channel 666. I started wondering if she might have invited something into our lives that day. My now stepdad dismissed my experiences, accusing me of making them up to seem cool. Just as he said that, a bottle flew off the fridge and nearly hit him. He never doubted me again. Years later, my older sister shared a nightmare she'd had as a child. She described a witch coming out of the closet, and I was shocked. It was the same closet in the same room at the same age as my own recurring nightmare. My dad admitted he always felt uneasy near that closet, even as an adult. I started to suspect that either my mom's Ouija board experience had opened something, or that the closet itself was a portal that let something follow me because I'm sensitive to the paranormal. The strangest experience came when I met my boyfriend. His cousin had taken his own life, and we rushed to the hospital to say goodbye. Standing in the room with his family, I was overwhelmed by the worst feeling of guilt. Tears streamed down my face as I kept thinking, "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean it." The guilt vanished the moment I left the room. Though my experiences have become less frequent over the years, they've never completely stopped. My life has been filled with random paranormal occurrences that I still can't explain. My husband and I moved into our current apartment a little over 2 years ago. It's a spacious, updated unit on the top floor of a 3-story building. We have a master bedroom with an attached bath, a guest bedroom, and a second restroom outside the guest room. It's peaceful, with only one neighbor who shares a wall with us, and they're rarely noisy. But even with such a calm setup, there have been a few occurrences that left me questioning what I've seen and heard. When we first moved in, I noticed something odd. The hall light outside the bedrooms would often be on in the morning, about 2 to 3 times a week. Initially, I thought one of us must have left it on by accident. But after multiple occurrences and repeated denials from my husband, I decided to test it. One night, as we headed to bed, I jokingly said to him, "Okay, this is me turning off the light, so we know for sure it's off in the morning." I turned it off and we went to bed. The next morning, while my husband was still asleep, I came out to find the hall light on again. The switch flipped up. My heart started racing. There was no reason for either of us to come out during the night. The master bedroom has a bathroom and we always go to bed with water bottles. Despite this unsettling pattern, the light incidents eventually stopped about 6 months ago, leaving me baffled. I've considered sleepwalking as an explanation since I used to do it years ago, but my husband assures me he hasn't seen me sleepwalk since, and he always used to catch me in the act. Another incident happened about a year ago in the master bedroom. I woke abruptly to a soft sound, a thud or a pop. The bedroom door leading to the balcony always lets in a bit of light from the streetlights outside. As I turned my head toward the door, I saw a figure standing about a foot in front of it. The silhouette was male, roughly 5 feet 7 inches, wearing a hat and facing our bed. The figure had no distinct features, but I could see its shoulders and torso clearly. Startled, I jolted out of bed and turned on the room's light, waking my husband in the process. Of course, there was nothing there. My heart pounded for a good 30 minutes as I tried to rationalize the experience. Was it a dream bleeding into reality? I'd had a similar encounter when I was 14, waking to see a figure standing by my bed. That time, it had been so close to my bedside lamp that I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the feeling of presence had been overwhelmingly real. The most significant incident happened just last night, which is why I decided to write all of this down. I had gone to bed at around 11:30 p.m. and woke up exactly 45 minutes later. I don't know why I woke, but I immediately noticed something unusual on my nightstand. It was black, roughly the size of a bird, and sitting only about a foot from my face. I watched it move to the left in a distinct, swaying motion, much like a bird walking. I jumped out of bed, terrified, and turned on the light, fully expecting to see an animal in the room. But there was nothing, no noise, no sign of movement. I searched everywhere, high and low, but found nothing. When I told my husband, he suggested it might have been another dream slipping into reality. But it had felt so vivid that I was certain there had been something there. What struck me most was what happened after I turned the light off. Almost instantly, I was flooded with a memory of my grandfather. I could see and hear him so clearly in my mind as I lay there trying to fall back asleep. His voice comforted me and eventually lulled me back to sleep. He passed away over 4 years ago, and there was no particular reason for him to be on my mind. I didn't question it until the morning. Was it him I saw? A ghost? A dream? Or something else entirely? There are also smaller things that happen from time to time, like the closet light being on when no one touched it, or faint thuds coming from the space above our apartment. Minor things, but they add to the puzzle. I'm not the type to dismiss paranormal experiences, but I also try to find rational explanations. Still, these incidents have left me with more questions than answers. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what might be happening. Thanks for reading, and I'll update if anything else occurs. In 1999, My ex-husband and I were living in Missouri with our 2 young boys, aged 3 and 1. We found a charming old farmhouse in the countryside with affordable rent. It was a 2-bedroom house at the top of a hill, accessed by a long gravel driveway. Surrounding the house were several old farm buildings, clearly remnants of a once thriving farm from the 1940s or 50s. We immediately fell in love with the place and moved in, though we didn't end up staying long, just 5 or 6 months. At first, everything seemed perfect. We were happy and settled in. But I couldn't shake a strange feeling when I sat on the screened-in sun porch at night. It overlooked the old buildings, and I often felt like I was being watched. The property had its fair share of night noises, which I chalked up to typical countryside sounds, but I began limiting my evening trips to the porch. We moved in around May or June, and by the time Halloween was approaching, the atmosphere had started to shift. One day, my ex-husband and I were outside with the boys near the old, sealed well. We wondered why it had been abandoned, as the owners had built a newer well nearby with a well house around it. Out of curiosity, we went into the well house and peered down the deep, dark hole. I made a comment about how creepy it was and wondered how far down it went. My ex suddenly said, "Wait, I think I see something," and climbed in slightly to retrieve it. When he came out, he was holding a wooden object. I took it from him and assumed it was some kind of Halloween decoration left by previous tenants. Without thinking much of it, I leaned it against the fence in the front yard as a decoration for the season. That's when things started happening. I noticed my 3-year-old son, who had always been close to his brother, suddenly started playing alone. I'd find him in different parts of the house, talking to someone. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids have imaginary friends all the time. But it went on for over a week. One afternoon, I called him into the kitchen for lunch. He came in, still in the middle of a conversation with no one. I asked who he was talking to, and with his limited vocabulary, he replied, "My friend." I asked if his friend was nice, and he nodded. Curious, I asked what his friend looked like. He shrugged and said, "He has no head." That caught me off guard. From that moment on, I didn't let him play alone and encouraged him to stick with his brother. He stopped talking about his friend during the day, but the nights were another story. For several nights, I'd wake up to my son crying and shaking me awake. Assuming he'd had a bad dream, I'd carry him back to bed, sing him a song and reassure him, but he always begged me not to leave, and this became a nightly ritual for about a week. One day, during a game of hide-and-seek, I stood in the hallway counting to 10. The hallway had an odd, low cupboard running along one side. As I counted, I heard the cupboard doors creak open. Thinking my boys had chosen to hide there, I tiptoed over and flung the doors open with a loud boo, but to my surprise, they weren't there. When I eventually found them, they had been hiding in the laundry room at the back of the house. The incident left me puzzled, but I didn't dwell on it. That night, I woke to my son screaming. I rushed to his room and found him sitting upright, crying and pointing to a small cupboard in his room. It was an oddly sized compartment at the bottom of a larger set of cupboards. The door was slightly open. I walked over and shut it, but he kept staring at it, trembling. I asked what was wrong, and he said, "That's where my friend stays." Chills ran down my spine. Trying to stay calm, I asked what his friend wanted. His reply shook me. "He's looking for something." I asked, "What is he looking for?" My son whispered, "His head." Terrified, I demanded to know the name of this friend. He said, "George." Out loud, I confronted the entity. "George, I know you want to find your head, but my son is only 3. He needs to sleep. Leave him alone or you'll deal with me." My son found it amusing to watch me yell at thin air, but it didn't solve the problem. For the next few nights, he'd scream and hide under his bed, refusing to open his eyes until I turned on the light. Finally, I moved both boys into my room, which seemed to stop the disturbances. On one of our last days there, I was sitting on the porch and noticed the wooden decoration we'd found in the well. Something urged me to take a closer look. The name George was carved into it, along with a last name, birth and death dates, and the chilling phrase, "He cannot rest until he finds his head." I felt sick. I had my ex-husband put the wood back in the well, and we packed up and left the house shortly after. After we moved, my son stopped having night terrors, and things went back to normal. I hoped he'd forget the ordeal, but years later, when he was 13, he brought it up, asking questions I couldn't answer. I was stunned he remembered so much. A year ago, I looked up the property on Google Earth. The house is gone now. I still wonder if George ever found his head. In March 2014, I started a new job in Missouri working for a marketing company. It was a demanding, travel-heavy job that kept me on the move. Luckily, my parents offered me a house they had inherited but weren't using. The house had been in my family since my great-grandfather built it in the 1960s. Though it came with a history, I saw it as a practical solution for a place to stay. The house's history, however, was far from ordinary. My great-grandfather had suffered from severe depression and tragically took his own life at work, wanting to spare his wife the trauma of finding him. But upon hearing of his death, my great-grandmother took her life in this very house. Afterward, the property passed to my grandfather, who later died of diabetes in a hospital. Eventually, my father inherited it and allowed my aunt and great-aunt, both elderly and disabled, to live there. My great-aunt moved into a nursing home where she passed away, and my aunt, who was a heavy smoker, died of cancer 2 years ago. Now, the house is mine, and I've been slowly repairing it as time and money allow. When I moved in, the house was in rough shape. I slept on the kitchen floor because the other rooms were either being painted or needed repairs. The nights were eerie. I heard creaks, cracks, and scratches that I later discovered were caused by raccoons. But there were also unexplained footsteps and knocking sounds. I tried to ignore them, but they made the house feel nightmarish. For the first year, I often slept with the lights on, my face buried in a pillow, and found more comfort on the road than at home. By April 2015, things had improved. I'd made significant progress, repainting rooms, replacing fixtures, and upgrading appliances. Finally, I had a proper bed and a house that felt more livable. But in hindsight, I may have made a mistake. Let me explain. When I first moved in, I noticed a voodoo talisman hanging on the front door. My aunt, who had lived there before me, wasn't superstitious as far as I knew, but I couldn't bring myself to remove it. Something about it unnerved me. Eventually, though, I decided it was time. Thinking, I'm a Christian, I don't believe in this ghost stuff, I threw the talisman away, along with the rusty pin that had held it. For weeks, nothing happened, and I thought I had nothing to worry about. That changed when I got a cat to keep me company. She was still adjusting to the house, so I pulled out a mattress and slept on the living room floor to keep her close. Big mistake. That night, as she ran around and meowed endlessly, I suddenly heard a distant yet clear voice, a girl's voice singing. The words sent chills down my spine. "Help me, I live here. Help me, I live right here." Her tone was desperate, crying. The sound echoed through the house, coming from the direction of the bathroom. I froze. It wasn't fear that paralyzed me, but an icy chill, as if a cold breeze had passed through me. When I finally gathered the courage to check, I found nothing, of course. But my cat had noticed too. She sat in the hallway, staring up at the door for hours, completely silent. I did some digging but found no record of a child ever living on or near this land, let alone dying in some tragic way. The house's history didn't match the ghost stories you'd typically expect. Still, I couldn't shake what I had heard. Just yesterday, I spoke with my neighbor about the experience. He shared something that made the situation even stranger. When his family moved into their home nearby, they discovered unsettling items in one of the bedrooms. A small Bible, satanic candles, chalk, and symbols drawn on the walls. Concerned, they hired a priest to bless their house. And since then, they haven't had any issues. According to him, the items belonged to a little boy who had lived there when the house was first built. Hearing his story gave me some context, but it left me with more questions than answers. I'm not the type to scare easily, and I'll face whatever comes my way. But this series of events, especially the girl's voice, has been bizarre to say the least. After taking some advice, I reached out to a local paranormal group. The woman I spoke with was intrigued by my experiences and excited to try and communicate with the girl I had encountered. She answered many of my questions, shedding new light on what might be happening. According to her, the girl might have latched on to me because of the deep meditative practices I used to do in college. Meditation, she explained, can sometimes create a heightened spiritual openness. Now that I no longer meditate, the girl could be struggling to communicate with me directly, but she continues to follow me, seeking help. I also asked about the talisman I had removed from the door. The woman told me it was likely my aunt's way of keeping spirits at bay. By removing it, I might have unintentionally broken the barrier, allowing the girl to return. The paranormal investigator attempted communication that night, but we didn't get much from the session. However, she said she sensed overwhelming grief and sadness, as though the girl had been carrying a heavy burden of guilt. The woman explained that the girl might have died during a time of intense emotional pain and urged me to help her cross over if I saw her again. She suggested telling the girl that it wasn't her fault and that everything would be okay. Unfortunately, the mysterious song I heard remained unanswered. That night, I had another vision of her. This time, I chose not to resist but instead tried to communicate. As I lay in bed, she opened the door to my room. "Is that you?" I asked, though speaking was difficult. My mouth felt numb, as though my body wasn't fully my own. She walked into the room, her presence quiet but heavy with emotion. "I'm not afraid of you this time," I said. She sat down on the bed beside me, her gaze fixed on the floor. "It's okay," I told her, trying to sound as reassuring as I could. As I spoke, I began to feel what the paranormal professional had described, an overwhelming wave of sadness and shame. I realized these emotions weren't mine. They were hers. Whatever she had done in life, she was carrying immense guilt. "I know you feel guilty," I said gently. "I don't know what you did, but it's okay." I focused on sending her comforting thoughts, willing her to feel forgiveness and peace. My body trembled as her presence lingered, the energy thick and heavy in the air. "There were people in this world who loved you, and they would have forgiven you," I continued. "And I forgive you." At those words, she lifted her head and looked at me for the first time. She smiled, a small, genuine smile, and placed her hand gently on my cheek. In that moment, I felt something extraordinary: warmth, comfort, and an overwhelming sense of peace. The emotions were so powerful, I almost cried. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished. I woke up from the vision with a start, unsure if this was truly the end of our connection. But I hope she understood what I was trying to tell her. I hope she found the light and some semblance of peace. I pray for her every day, wishing that she has finally let go of the pain she carried. This event happened in September or October of 2014 while I was staying at my mom's house in Missouri. It was my second trip out there, the first being around the same time the previous year. Let me start by mentioning their dog. He's a 2-year-old European boxer. Playful, gentle, and never one to bark or growl unless he's playing. So when he reacts to something, it's worth paying attention. It was midday, around 3 p.m. I was waiting for my mom and her boyfriend to come home from grocery shopping. She had called me about 2 minutes before, saying they were just leaving Walmart and would be home in about 25 minutes. The Walmart they shop at is a 20-minute drive from the house, so I knew they wouldn't be back for a while. I decided to pass the time by playing a game on my laptop. From my room, I had a clear view of the front yard and driveway because the curtains were open, as were the bathroom blinds. My room has an attached bathroom facing the front of the house. This setup is perfect for keeping an eye out for visitors or the mailman. As I waited for the game to load, I suddenly heard loud footsteps in the front hallway. Almost immediately, the dog started barking. A deep, aggressive bark with growls mixed in. This was unusual. He had been lying on the living room couch moments before, and I had never heard him growl like that. The footsteps continued into the kitchen, followed by the unmistakable sounds of cabinets opening and closing, along with dishes being moved around. The house isn't very large, so the noises were loud and clear. For a moment, I just sat there, listening to someone rummaging through the kitchen while the dog barked. My first instinct was to check if my mom and her boyfriend had somehow arrived home early, but when I glanced outside, the driveway was empty. The car wasn't there. My second thought was more alarming. Could this be an intruder? With that possibility in mind, I grabbed the pocket knife on my desk and my phone, ready to dial 911 if needed. Quietly, I opened my bedroom door and leaned out, which gave me a perfect view into the kitchen. But there was no one there. All the sounds had stopped, and the dog was calmly walking back into the living room as if nothing had happened. This didn't make sense. There was no way someone could have left the house so quickly without me noticing. There are only 3 doors leading outside. The front door, the back door, which opens into a fenced backyard, and the door in the kitchen that leads to the garage. The back door was in my line of sight the entire time, so I would have seen someone leave that way. The front door was down the hallway, and I would have heard or seen someone running toward it. As for the garage door, it's old and squeaky. Any movement would have been impossible to miss. Standing there in the quiet house, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I had just experienced might not have been something ordinary. Could it have been paranormal? I don't live in the house full-time, just a couple of months at a time during visits, so I don't know if it's haunted. But hearing all those sounds, clear as day, without anyone physically present, left me questioning. I never saw anything. I only heard what sounded like someone rummaging through the kitchen. The dog's reaction, the vividness of the sounds, and the complete absence of anyone else made it hard to dismiss. Even though I didn't see anything, this experience stuck with me. I've never encountered anything quite like it before or since. When I was in high school, I dated a guy named Isaiah. He was everything I could have asked for. Kind, supportive, and one of the best people in my life. He was a year older than me, and we dated throughout his senior year. After graduation, Isaiah joined the Army and went to Maryland for basic training. Neither of us knew where he'd be sent after that. At 16, I wasn't ready to be an Army girlfriend. We broke up but stayed on good terms. Isaiah would write me letters and occasionally call. I was his only real connection to Missouri. His relationship with his father was strained, and his mother had moved to California with her new husband, rarely keeping in touch. He didn't have any siblings, so I became one of the few people he confided in. Despite our continued contact, I started dating someone new, a guy named Jack. Jack was 22 and worked as a mechanic at a friend's dad's garage. We dated through my senior year, and while Jack knew Isaiah and I were friends, he didn't know we had once dated. In December, Isaiah came back to Missouri for a visit. Instead of heading to California to see his mom, he stayed with a friend near my hometown. Jack had been busy working long hours to save for a new car, so I hadn't seen him much. Isaiah encouraged me to visit him while he was home, and after some hesitation, I gave in. That night, we slept together. Isaiah knew about Jack, and after returning overseas, he stopped writing to me. We lost touch completely. Then, in early January, his mother called me with devastating news. Isaiah had been killed in Afghanistan. I never told anyone what happened between Isaiah and me that night. Around Valentine's Day, I found out I was pregnant. Young, scared, and unsure of what to do, I let Jack believe the baby was his. We stayed together and built a life. Fast forward to now. Jack and I are married with 2 children, our 8-year-old, Eli, and our 3-year-old Parker. Only I know the truth that Eli is Isaiah's son. I've planned to tell him when he's older, but life had other plans. One Tuesday evening, while Jack was working a late shift, Parker ran out of the room he shared with Eli, shouting, "Mommy, there's a man in our room." Startled, I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and rushed to their room. I flipped on the lights, but the room was empty except for Eli, fast asleep. I've always been a bit superstitious, and based on other strange experiences in our apartment, I assumed Parker had encountered one of the harmless spirits that occasionally lingered there. I took him to the living room and asked him to describe what he saw. "What was the man wearing?" I asked, trying to piece together the encounter. "Camo," Parker said, "but not like Dad's. It's like what G.I. Jane wears. And he was all bloody." Took me a moment to process. The ghosts I'd noticed in the apartment before had always been older, women in hospital gowns, men in suits. This was new. Did he say anything to you? What was he doing? He was patting Eli's back. I asked him who he was, and he said he was Eli's daddy. I told him that wasn't right because Jack is Eli's daddy, and then he looked kind of mad, so I came to get you. I froze, stunned. Listening closely, I realized I could hear the faint clink of dog tags coming from the bedroom. I reassured Parker and let him sleep in my room that night. I couldn't shake the conclusion. Isaiah had found his way back, not to harm, but to visit his son. When Jack came home later that night, I told him the truth about Eli's father. He was understandably upset, but we talked through it and decided to face it together. We agreed not to tell Eli just yet. It would only confuse him. We'll wait until he's older, maybe middle school, before we explain everything. Since then, Parker occasionally comes to my room, asking to sleep with me because the man is back. While it unsettles me, I don't mind Isaiah visiting Eli. I just wonder why it took him so long to make himself known, and why he hasn't appeared to Eli yet. This story takes place in St. Louis, Missouri, a bustling city with so much to explore. In 2012, when I was 19, my fiancé and I moved there with his father. It was an exciting time, full of new adventures, and one of the highlights was a visit to the infamous Lemp Mansion, known for its haunted reputation. My soon-to-be father-in-law, whose birthday is in October, thought it would be fun to celebrate with a spooky experience. So he gathered all of us, my fiancé, his grandmother, his two stepsisters, and me, for a guided tour of the mansion. Given my past experiences with the supernatural, you'd think I'd stay far away from anything paranormal. But instead, I was intrigued. Curiosity always seemed to get the better of me. However, what happened that night at Lemp Mansion was enough to scare me straight. The tour begins. The tour group consisted of us and several others. From the start, my fiancé, Corey, and his father began lagging behind on purpose, taking photos of every room they could. The tour allowed photographs, but strictly no video or audio recordings. His grandmother and the girls stayed with the group, while I tried to act as the link between Corey and his father and the rest of us. I didn't want them to get into trouble, but this meant I often found myself wandering alone. The mansion has a well-documented, tragic history. Almost every member of the Lemp family died by suicide, and the house is steeped in unsettling energy. While I won't recount all the details, those are easy to find online. Just knowing the history was enough to make the experience unnerving. The highest level of the house. When the tour reached the top floor, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, as though I wasn't supposed to be there. We entered a room where the guide had us turn off the lights for darkroom time. Everyone sat in silence, and people began asking questions, hoping for a response from the spirits. That's when I heard something in the hallway. Loud, distinct sounds like footsteps echoed closer and closer to the room. No one was in the hall, neither Corey nor his father, and yet the noise persisted. Others claimed to see shadows moving, but it was too dark for me to see anything clearly. Afterward, the tour continued downstairs, but Corey and his father lingered behind, snapping more photos despite my warnings that they'd get us kicked out. Frustrated, I decided to do a little exploring of my own. The push on the stairs. As I approached the staircase, I hesitated, remembering the dread I had felt climbing up earlier. Suddenly, I felt a force shove me from behind. I would have fallen if not for the handrail. Shaken, I hurried down the stairs as fast as I could. The basement encounter. What I did next would have definitely gotten me thrown out if I'd been caught. I went to the basement even though it was off limits. It was pitch black and I didn't have a flashlight. Something deep inside me, a voice, almost warned me not to go further. I snapped a picture at the top of the stairs and quickly left. The tug in the kitchen. I wandered into the kitchen area and started examining the photos on the walls. As I turned to get a better look, I felt a tug on my shirt and purse, like a playful child trying to get my attention. Expecting to see my fiancé's little sister, I turned around, but no one was there. When I called out to the guide, she casually replied, "Yep, happens all the time." The photos. That night, back at home, we reviewed the photos we had taken. What we saw disturbed me deeply. The photo I had taken at the top of the basement stairs revealed a dark, shadowy face with demonic features lurking in the shadows. Corey and his father had captured something equally unsettling. A little girl in period clothing, reflected in a large mirror in one of the rooms. The girl wasn't visible when the photo was taken, and we weren't sure if it was an illusion or something paranormal. The aftermath. The images haunted me. Every time I looked at my photo, the ominous face filled me with dread. I eventually deleted it. I still don't know if my father-in-law kept his photos, but I plan to ask him about it. What unsettled me the most was the feeling I got from the basement. That dark, oppressive energy. Later, I learned that the basement had a grim history. One of the Lemp sons ran a brothel there, and the basement connects to underground tunnels leading to the Lemp brewery. These tunnels reportedly pass through sacred Native American land, which might explain the oppressive energy I felt. That experience at Lemp Mansion changed me. I no longer want to ghost hunt or actively seek out spirits. Whatever I felt in that house, especially in the basement, was enough to last a lifetime. I hope you enjoyed my story, and if you're ever in St. Louis, I dare you to visit the Lemp Mansion. Just be careful what you might bring back with you. I recently visited Bozeman, Montana, to spend some time with my brother and his fiancée. They were renting a house while waiting for their new home to be completed. On my first night there, they warned me, half-jokingly, that the house was haunted. I brushed it off, as I've always been a bit skeptical about ghosts having any real ability to interact with us. Still, I went to bed that night feeling a little uneasy and left the light on at first. Around 3 a.m., I woke up and decided it was silly to keep the light on, so I turned it off and tried to go back to sleep. But I couldn't. I tossed and turned until I ended up lying on my back, staring at the ceiling in the dark. That's when it started. I heard a low, humming tone, almost like the sound of an electrical switch being flipped. Almost immediately, I felt vibrations rippling through my entire body, from my head to my toes. The sensation moved up and down, wave after wave. It wasn't like anything I'd ever felt before. As the vibrations continued, I began to hear a man's voice, though his words were incoherent at first, like mumbling. Wanting to respond, I tried to say, "Okay," to let him know I was listening, but all that came out were gasps and grunts. I kept trying to speak, even managing to think of asking, "What are you doing here?" But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't form the words. Then I saw him. A man appeared at the side of my bed, near my feet. He looked to be in his 60s, dressed in a button-down shirt tucked into pants, with his hands casually in his pockets. I could clearly see his face, balding or completely bald, and his lips were slightly more illuminated than the rest of him. He looked at me and said, "Well, I was just up here. So, that was all." To make it even eerier, I was staying in the upstairs bedroom, and I was the only one on that floor that night. The moment he spoke, he disappeared. At the same time, the vibrations and the humming tones stopped. I lay there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. Afterward, I started researching sleep paralysis, which made me question if I had actually been awake during the encounter. But the physical sensations, the clarity of his voice and appearance, and the way I struggled to speak all felt so real that I can't completely believe it was just a natural phenomenon. The next day, I told my brother and his fiancée about the experience. To my surprise, they shared similar stories. Just a week earlier, my brother's fiancée had heard a man's voice say, "This is Bill?" She also described the same vibrating sensation and the feeling of being frozen and unable to move. Their bed would often vibrate for no apparent reason, sometimes during the day, other times at night. She also told me about hearing a woman's voice one night, saying, "Look at her lips," referring to her trembling mouth as she tried to speak but couldn't. Needless to say, what was supposed to be a relaxing trip filled with snowboarding, good food, and family time turned into an unexpected journey into the paranormal, centered around Bill and his mysterious companions in the house. I've always been a skeptic, but after that trip, I'm not so sure anymore. A little background before I dive into my story. I've always enjoyed ghost hunting, and living in Montana offers plenty of opportunities. Old hospitals, cemeteries, and historic buildings. I've always been somewhat sensitive to the other side. I can see and hear things, though I usually keep these experiences to myself. Only a few close friends know about my gift. Here's what happened. It was October 31st, 2007. My college roommates and I decided to go ghost hunting at an old, abandoned hospital about 2 hours away from our dorm. My roommates, Damon and Justin, sharing their names with permission, were just as curious as I was. Damon, in particular, was excited and brought along a Ouija board, a vintage one from the mid-1900s that he'd received as a gift from his stepfather. I personally don't mess with Ouija boards. I've always believed them to be dangerous and potentially evil. The hospital was massive, so we decided to split up. I, trying to be the brave one, explored the northern wing alone while Damon and Justin went to the southern side. Since we were broke college students, we didn't have fancy equipment. Just a pen and notepad for recording anything unusual. While I was exploring, Damon and Justin pulled out the Ouija board. They'd used it before and claimed to have had some strong experiences. They immediately got a response when they started, with the planchette moving in figure eights for a while before spelling out the name Joe. They continued communicating, asking Joe to move objects or make noises. To their amazement, Joe eventually tipped over a flashlight for them. Emboldened, they asked it to show itself. Joe refused, but they pressed further, mocking it and calling it weak. After more provocation, it finally agreed but warned them that they would regret it. Damon then asked Joe to show itself to me. The planchette moved in quick figure eights before stopping abruptly on goodbye. Unaware of what they had done, I was in a 30-foot by 30-foot room on the other side of the hospital. I called out, asking if anyone was there with me and if they could make themselves known. Almost immediately, my flashlight went dead. That's when I saw it. Something in the corner of the room. It looked like a pale white figure, contorted backward on all fours with its back arched unnaturally. It was completely bald and had no clothes on. I could tell it was female, but its appearance was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Fear gripped me, but I reminded myself that many ghost hunters go their entire lives without seeing a full-bodied apparition. This was my chance. I forced myself to step closer. The figure didn't move or make a sound. It just stayed in its twisted position, staring into the darkness. I got within 10 feet of it before I froze. My courage failed me when its head slowly turned, and I locked eyes with it, pitch-black eyes. Then it grinned, a predatory smile that made me feel like prey. I felt like a rabbit staring down a wolf. That was it. I turned and bolted, screaming for Damon and Justin. We left immediately. The drive back to the dorm was silent. My roommates knew me as someone brave, and seeing me shaken enough to stay quiet for 2 hours in the dead of night left them uneasy. When we finally got back, we recounted everything that had happened. I realized then that as soon as their Ouija board session had ended, Joe must have come to find me. To this day, I don't know what I saw. Was it a ghost? A demon? All I know is that it felt real, like I could have reached out and touched it, yet it was something completely unearthly. For the record, I wasn't under the influence of drugs or alcohol. I'm in good physical and mental health, apart from being a little out of shape. But that night left me questioning everything. My first encounter with the paranormal happened when I was 10 years old. My mother and I lived on my grandfather's land near Ballantine, Montana, in the countryside. The property had an eerie history. An old homestead had burned down there long ago, and there was also an Indian burial ground nearby. One day, I walked into my room, and as I stepped through the door, a small toy flew off my shelf with such force that it dented the wall and broke into pieces. I was terrified and spent the night sleeping in my mother's room. Ever since that day, I've been sensitive to paranormal activity. During my years living with my mother, I experienced knives flying off tables, doors slamming on their own, cupboards opening, and even bathroom doors creaking open while I was in the shower. When I was 12, I moved into the largest room in the house after my sister moved out. One night, I woke up unable to breathe. It felt like someone was choking me, with immense pressure on my neck. I sat up gasping for air, and when I turned on the light, I saw red finger marks on my neck. There was no explanation for how it happened. Another time, when I was 16, I believe a spirit tried to communicate with me through sound. I had a stereo in my room, and one night, I woke up to strange, rhythmic humming coming from the speakers. It sounded almost like a language, but I couldn't make out the words. Turning the stereo on and off didn't stop it, nor did unplugging it. Even after disconnecting the wires, the sound continued. For 2 weeks, the noises persisted, and then, as suddenly as they started, they stopped. That same year, I had one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I dreamt that the devil kidnapped me and a couple of friends. He chained us to a wall, and before I woke up, he pressed his fiery hand against my chest, burning me. When I awoke, there was a bright red handprint on my chest. It burned and stayed visible for 2 days. I even took a picture of it because I couldn't believe what had happened. To this day, I'm haunted by the memory of that dream. About 6 months before I moved out of my mother's house, the strange activity increased. We had an unfinished basement with tools scattered around for projects. Twice, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of tools being dragged across the floor downstairs. Too scared to investigate in the dark, I checked the basement the next morning. Shovels were out of place, buckets of nails had been tipped over, and other tools were moved. Living in the country, I knew it couldn't have been an intruder. At 18, I moved in with my fiancé to a house that once belonged to his grandparents. His grandfather had passed away in the house from cancer. From the moment I moved in, the activity started again. The oven timer would go off randomly, and we would come home to find the bathtub running or the living room fan on when we were certain everything was off. Over time, these experiences became more frequent and intense. 4 nights ago, I had my first sighting of a shadow figure in this house. It was around 11 p.m., and my fiancé was still at work. I was lying in bed with my cat, Puss, about to fall asleep, when she suddenly jerked her head up. I opened my eyes and followed her gaze. Emerging from my closet, I saw a shadowy man, about 5 feet 6 inches, standing there. He disappeared after 2 seconds, but those moments left me shaken. Since then, I won't go to sleep unless my fiancé is home. The activity didn't stop there. For the past 2 nights, my fiancé and I have been waking up to the sound of creaking doors. The strange part? Our house is old, but the only door is the one leading outside. We don't have a bedroom door, and none of the cabinets squeak or the floors creak. After the sound, I've seen a black shadow figure, this time not in human form. Instead, it's a dark blob of energy that appears on the ceiling. I've seen it twice now. I don't know why I'm so sensitive to these things, but the experiences are becoming more intense. Now, being 4 months pregnant with my first child, I'm worried that I might pass the sensitivity on to them. It seems to run in my family, and I can only hope that my little one won't have to deal with the fear and uncertainty I faced. 4 years ago, I decided to return to the Billings area. I had left all my furniture and belongings behind at my previous residence out of state, staying with former roommates until I could find a suitable rental and move everything. For months, I couch-surfed while searching for a home with enough space for me and my belongings. In a twist of fate, while visiting a friend at her workplace, a man came in complaining about tenants who had abandoned his rental property in the middle of the night without notice. The house was only a few blocks away, and after hearing about its size and surprisingly affordable rent, I made an appointment to see it. The house stood out. It was a charming, small Dutch colonial-style home, nestled between 2 1960s ranch-style houses. Its unique details gave it character, and it was clear someone had invested time and effort to personalize it. It also seemed like one of the oldest homes on the block. Inside, the original fixtures, windows, doors, and even the fireplace were intact, though the kitchen had been poorly updated with damaged carpet and sloppy stencil designs on the breakfast nook. Despite these flaws, I loved the house and took the rental immediately. The house had 3 bedrooms, 2 on the main floor and 1 in the basement, a living room, dining room, kitchen, and a single bathroom. The first few months were uneventful. I moved in my furniture, repainted the interior and exterior, and replaced the kitchen carpet with vinyl flooring. But while finishing the flooring and painting the breakfast nook, I smelled something strange. It was a strong, sweet floral perfume, overpowering but not unpleasant. The scent came and went quickly and started occurring during household chores, like dusting or cleaning windows. Once, I even smelled it while mowing the front lawn. Though I could never find its source, it seemed harmless, and I eventually learned to ignore it. For months after moving in, a friend became my roommate. During the chaos of her move, boxes and items were stacked in the living room and kitchen. One night, I went to bed while she stayed in the living room. I was later awakened by a knock on my bedroom door, but when I opened it, no one was there. Walking down the hallway, I found my roommate sitting on the couch, looking stunned. She explained that she had seen a dark shadow leave the kitchen and head down the hallway toward our bedrooms. She insisted she hadn't knocked on my door, but admitted she was too creeped out to walk down the hallway to her room. After that night, others began reporting seeing a shadowy figure in the hallway, especially friends who stayed overnight on the couch. One guest mentioned smelling the same floral perfume and feeling as though they were being watched in the bathroom. Items would occasionally go missing, only to reappear in odd places. For instance, a full bottle of soda left on the kitchen counter was later found on the dining room table. The dining room became a focal point for strange occurrences. Although rarely used, I had hung an antique chandelier above the dining table. Strangely, the chandelier would often turn itself on when no one was in the room. I had the wiring checked and even replaced the dimmer switch twice, but the light continued turning on by itself. Whenever we set the table for use, the drapes, usually left open, would mysteriously be found closed. My roommate's closet doors never stayed shut, no matter how many times she closed them, and the drapes in my bedroom would occasionally open on their own. The basement bedroom, used mostly for storage, was especially unsettling. Twice, I allowed friends to stay there temporarily. Both reported feeling uneasy and experienced health issues during their stay. Interestingly, reactions to the house varied. Some visitors found it strange, while others thought it was cozy and inviting. My dogs, however, refused to enter the dining room or go down the basement stairs. Despite all this, I've never felt afraid. I've always believed that someone who loved this house deeply once lived here and still lingers. I jokingly call her our housekeeper. She only seems to make her presence known when things are out of place or if she's curious. The formal nature of the house makes me think she turns on the dining room chandelier as a reminder that we should eat there. As for the basement bedroom, I've decided not to use it as a living space anymore. Whatever is happening here feels more like a lingering spirit than something malevolent. Maybe one day, I'll even catch a glimpse of our housekeeper. When I was younger, I had numerous paranormal and spiritual experiences. Growing up in a strictly conservative Christian household made me an unusually fearful child. By the time I was 17, I reached a breaking point and decided to close myself off to the spiritual world as much as possible. The fears had become overwhelming, and I no longer wanted to live in constant dread. I made a conscious choice to ignore any spiritual activity around me and refuse to be afraid. At first, it wasn't easy, but by the time I turned 20, I had conditioned myself to block out these experiences. I had become so detached from them that they no longer bothered me. While I couldn't completely shut off my awareness of spiritual happenings, I managed to convince myself they weren't noteworthy or worth my attention. Over time, this mindset seemed to have an interesting side effect. I became what I can only describe as a ghost repellent. Whenever I visited places known to be haunted, I rarely sensed any activity. Even people with me who were highly sensitive to the paranormal would comment on the quietness of these spaces in my presence. It was as though my indifference discouraged ghosts or spirits from making themselves known. Fast forward to about 5 years ago, shortly after I finished college. There was a house near where I lived that I admired every time I passed by. It was a charming brick and stone home with ivy trailing along the front. Though I had recently moved into another place, I couldn't help but feel drawn to it. When I saw the for rent sign go up 2 years later, I knew I had to check it out. The house exceeded my expectations. It had an undeniable charm and seemed perfect for me. While touring it, I found an unopened package of curtains in a kitchen cupboard. The style name printed on the package matched my name. It was a small, cheesy coincidence, but to me, it felt like confirmation that this house was meant for me. I signed the lease and moved in at the end of October. Even before moving in, I had sensed something unusual about the house. It wasn't menacing, but it felt like the house wasn't truly empty. Still, I shrugged it off and focused on how perfect it was. The day I moved in solidified my suspicions. My roommate and I spent all day shuttling items between houses, and during that time, I repeatedly heard someone call my name. It sounded like a voice coming from another room, as though trying to get my attention. Each time, I asked my roommate what she wanted, only for her to insist she hadn't said anything. This continued even when I was alone in the house. Eventually, I realized what was happening and decided to stop responding. The voice stopped shortly afterward. Another strange thing happened that day. The back door kept opening and closing on its own. At first, my roommate didn't believe me, but when she saw it for herself, she was seriously freaked out. Her reaction made me feel uneasy, too, but I quickly decided that I wasn't going to let this haunt me, literally or figuratively. This house was mine now, and I wasn't going to let anything ruin it. When my roommate left for a short trip to our old house, I addressed the issue directly. I said aloud, "Hey, you can't keep opening and closing the back door. I have pets, and if the door is left open, they could get out. That's not okay. If you need to mess with doors, stick to the interior ones." To my surprise, the back door stopped moving on its own that same day. Interior doors haven't been an issue either. Since then, the activity in the house has been minimal. Most occurrences can be chalked up to the house's age, creaks, groans, and the like. The one exception happened about 2 weeks ago. I was leaving for work when a baking pan flew off the stove and landed across the room in front of me. It didn't feel like an attack. It was more like it was placed there to block my path. I've chosen not to research the history of the house or try to communicate with whatever might be there. My ghost-repellent tendencies seem to have kicked in, and the house has been largely quiet. I've lived here for just over a month now, and aside from the baking pan incident, there's been no significant activity. I don't know if my presence has driven out whatever was here before or simply encouraged it to rest. Either way, I'm fine with the peace. While this story might not be as dramatic as others, it's been years since I've encountered this level of activity in a place I've lived. And now, with the house seemingly dormant, I feel like I've truly made it my own. A few days or maybe a week after my dog Bear came home from surgery, something terrifying happened. He'd had part of a tumor removed, but the vet couldn't remove it all because it was on his liver. We knew the tumor would grow back and eventually take him, but the cost of a complete removal was just too high. Every night after his surgery, I slept lightly, ready to leap up at the slightest sound. I was constantly worried he might pass away in the night. It was after midnight, and Bear was panting. I opened my window and aimed a fan at him to keep him cool. He lay in his dog bed beneath the window, and I positioned the fan toward him, not the door, which was across the room. After a while, I drifted off to sleep, comforted by the light I kept on at night. Then it happened. The doorknob started to rattle, as if someone was trying to open the door. My eyes flew open, and I froze, waiting for someone to enter. I thought maybe it was my mom or one of my siblings, but then I remembered they were all downstairs, sound asleep. My stomach dropped. I sat up, staring at the door. The doorknob kept twisting, and the entire door was shaking. It didn't make sense. An earthquake? No, the rest of the room was still. Was someone playing a prank? I glanced at Bear. He was sitting up, staring at the door just as intently as I was. That gave me both comfort and fear. Whatever was happening, Bear saw it too. Not wanting to be far from him, I whispered, "Bear!" The moment I spoke, the rattling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I held my breath, straining to hear footsteps or the creak of the stairs. But there was nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I told my mom about what happened. Her response made my skin crawl. She casually said my door moves at night. She explained that one evening while lying in bed, she saw my door slowly open, then close slightly, and finally slam shut. Concerned, she got up to investigate. When she opened the door, she only saw Bear lying awake in his bed, while I slept soundly. She added something else. My door is heavy, too heavy to be moved by a draft. It gave me chills. Mom then shared another unsettling story. While painting the laundry room walls one day, she heard a low, demonic growl. She froze, her brush mid-stroke. The two cats in the room with her also reacted. They stared intently at the vent, as if they heard it too. The day we moved into that house coincided with Bear's return from surgery. It was late July, a few weeks after my 19th birthday. The house was in rough shape. Broken windows, filthy carpets, and the smell of animal waste hanging in the air. We replaced the carpet and moved in out of necessity. We'd been evicted from our previous home and didn't have many options. From the start, the house felt wrong. Every noise made us jump, and there was an undeniable sense of something dark lingering around us. Before the door-shaking incident, I had a horrific dream. I won't go into detail, but it involved a monster in the basement trying to eat me. It was so vivid and terrifying that I woke my mom up and asked her to sit with me. I didn't sleep that night either. Other things began to happen. Mom often heard footsteps upstairs when she was sleeping downstairs in the living room. We heard cats yowling from the vents, sounds that didn't belong to our cats. Over time, the oppressive presence we felt when we first moved in seemed to fade, but my bad dreams didn't stop. They were less frequent but still haunting, involving monsters, bloody Bibles, devils, and encounters with death. 2 months ago, our landlord refused to fix the flooding basement and broken windows. We stopped paying rent and he evicted us. While packing to leave, the dark presence returned. Mom felt it most. Then, one night, something deeply unsettling happened. Mom woke up to see a teenage boy standing over her. She nudged my stepdad awake and asked, "Who the hell are you?" The boy claimed my brother had invited him over. Mom told him to leave immediately, which he did, but when she questioned my brother the next day, his reaction was pure shock. He didn't know anyone by the boy's name and hadn't invited anyone over. Who or what was that boy? Since moving out, I haven't had a single bad dream. The moment we unpacked in our new home, it felt peaceful, warm, and safe. No ghosts, no demons, just quiet. Still, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I'd opened my door that night. Was it death coming for Bear? That monster from my dream? Or maybe nothing at all? I used to doubt my mom's stories about the paranormal, but after that house, I believe her. Oh. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Oh. Ever since I was 10, I've noticed things that most kids my age wouldn't. That was the year I saw my first spirit. It happened during the summer when I was visiting my grandmother. My first time spending a summer away from my family. About 2 weeks into my visit, something strange happened. I went to bed around 10:30 p.m., and as usual, my grandmother closed my door before heading to her room down the hall. I was in the guest room, and she went to bed shortly after me. Around midnight, I was fast asleep when I suddenly woke up with an overwhelming sense of being watched. When I opened my eyes, I saw an older man standing in the doorway. He looked like he was in his late 70s, wearing a suit that seemed straight out of the 1800s, so unlike anything people wore in 2005. This was in Astoria, Oregon. He wasn't looking at me, though. He was staring down the hall toward my grandmother's room. Calmly, he told me, "Watch your grandmother. She's in danger." I wasn't sure why, but I wasn't terrified of him, even though I was scared. His presence felt calm, almost protective, as though he knew her. But I was only 10, and it was still unnerving. I ducked under the covers for a few seconds. When I looked back, he was gone, and the door was closed. The sense of someone being there had disappeared entirely. The next morning, I told my grandmother what happened. She wasn't surprised. "That was my grandfather," she explained. "He always looked out for me. He must have been checking on who was in my house since it's your first time here." A few days later, we were driving to the beach. My grandmother had taken her medication just before we left. As I stared out the window, I saw the same man from a few nights before, standing on the side of the road. He pointed ahead. I looked over at my grandmother and realized she had fallen asleep at the wheel. A large truck was roaring toward us from the opposite direction. Panicked, I grabbed the steering wheel and pulled us away from the truck. I yanked the emergency brake, and we came to a stop 6 miles outside of Seaside, Oregon. I woke her up and told her everything. It was terrifying, but I couldn't help feeling like her grandfather had saved us. The following year, in 2006, we had moved to Chinook, Montana. One day, while walking home from school, I saw a girl hiding behind a tree. She seemed shy, so I asked why she was hiding. She stepped out, and I noticed scars on her face and scratches on her arms. She told me her name was Elizabeth. I invited her to my house, completely unaware she wasn't a living person. When I got home, I asked my mom if a friend could stay for dinner. She said yes and asked, "Where is she?" I pointed to Elizabeth and said, "Right here." My mom froze and said, "No one's here." I argued with her, but it was pointless. I went to my room, and Elizabeth followed. Later that evening, my dad, who was a police officer, came home. He looked exhausted, having just returned from the scene of a car accident. At dinner, I mentioned my new friend Elizabeth. My dad's face turned pale, and he started to cry. He told me a 14-year-old girl named Elizabeth had died in the accident that same afternoon, around the time I had been walking home. Now I'm 17, and spirits seem to follow me everywhere. They watch me, beg for help, and plead for things I don't understand. One of them, a demonic presence named John, refuses to leave me alone. He tells me horrifying things number 17-year-old should ever hear, and insists I'm going to die young. I'm terrified of him. His words haunt me, making me paranoid to even leave the house. I've tried researching ways to protect myself, but I feel like I'm drowning. There's also a woman named Kate. She claims to be my mother from a past life. She's controlling and threatening, telling me what to do and punishing me when she thinks I've been a bad daughter. She has a little girl with her named Haley, a mischievous 5-year-old who plays tricks on me and makes things fall around the house. It's overwhelming. I can feel people's emotions and sense their pain as if it's my own. I know what's wrong with others just by being near them, and it's exhausting. Sometimes, I wonder if it's all connected, this sensitivity to spirits and the auras of people around me. This is my story, and I've never shared it with anyone before. I'm desperate for help. I need to get rid of these spirits, especially John. I just want to live a normal life, free from fear and torment. I used to brush off my experiences as a child, but now I know they're real, and I don't know how much more I can take. I live in a small town in Montana called Elliston. It's a quiet place now, but it has a history as a mining community, full of rough characters and, likely, its fair share of crime and tragedy. It's not hard to imagine that some of that history might linger in the form of restless spirits. One evening, my friend Garrett and I were at the community gym shooting hoops, just talking and having a good time. Our conversation turned to the idea of how haunted Elliston might be, given its past. We couldn't believe there wasn't at least one ghost in town, and right then we decided to try to find out. We turned off all the lights in the gym and sat on the stage where local school plays are performed. The darkness enveloped the space, and we sat quietly, listening. At first, we were trying to distinguish between the normal creaks and groans of an old building and anything that might be truly unusual. The floor made heavy-sounding creaks, and after a while, it seemed like they were coming in a straight line from one end of the gym toward us. Still unsure if we were imagining things, we stayed put, trying to remain as quiet as possible. After several loud creaks, I thought I saw a faint light coming from the girls' locker room on the opposite end of the gym. I didn't mention it at first, thinking Garrett might be playing a trick on me with his laser pointer. Eventually, I asked him if his laser could change colors. He said it couldn't and asked why I'd brought it up. I told him what I saw and suggested we wait quietly to see if it would happen again. We sat for another 10 minutes, and then we both saw it. A dim, yellow orb of light, slightly larger than a golf ball. It moved quickly, darting back and forth across the north wall of the gym and disappearing into the girls' locker room. Moments later, it came out again, moving down the east wall toward us before retreating to the locker room once more. This strange movement repeated for about 5 minutes. Then the orb changed its behavior. It made its way to the center of the gym floor, stopping about 15 feet in front of us. Suddenly, it shot back to the locker room, re-emerged, and moved rapidly along the walls, finally stopping right at our feet on the stage. It brightened slightly and began darting back and forth within a 6-inch area for a few seconds before shooting back into the locker room. This time, it didn't come back out. Normally, I'd assume it was some sort of reflection, moonlight bouncing off a reflective surface, perhaps. But Garrett and I searched the entire gym afterward and couldn't find anything yellow or reflective. The light's movement wasn't predictable or consistent, like a reflection would be. It behaved in a way that felt almost alive, random, curious, and deliberate. Was it a ghostly orb? I can't say for sure. But the way it moved, the atmosphere it created, and the chills it gave me made it hard to dismiss as something mundane. That night turned me into a believer, especially since this wasn't the only experience I've had in that gym. Whatever it was, it felt real, and it's something I'll never forget.